Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The realtor handed me the keys with the particular urgency of someone passing off a burning coal. Her fingers didn't linger. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She told me to call if I needed anything, but her business card had already been crumpled at the bottom of my pocket before I even turned to face the house. A two-story Victorian that seemed to sag under its own weight, paint peeling in long strips like dead skin, windows reflecting nothing but gray November sky. I should have asked more questions. The price was absurd, less than half what comparable properties in the area commanded. When I'd pressed the previous owner during our brief phone call, his voice had gone thin and distant. He wanted to get rid of bad memories, he said. His wife had left. The house reminded him of her. I understood that kind of pain, the way certain spaces can become soaked with the residue of what we've lost. My own divorce had left me desperate for exactly this. Somewhere new, somewhere quiet, somewhere the walls hadn't absorbed years of whispered arguments and cold silences. I moved in on a Friday. The afternoon light struggled through curtains I hadn't hung, casting the living room in a sepia tone that made everything look older than it was. The furniture I'd brought, a couch, a bed, a small dining table, sat in the empty rooms like afterthoughts, dwarfed by high ceilings and walls that seemed to stretch further than they should. The house smelled of dust and something else underneath, something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. That first night, I blamed the settling noises on old pipes. Victorian houses groan, I told myself. They shift and creak like arthritic joints. The sound of something falling in the kitchen, a sharp crack followed by the unmistakable scatter of ceramic on tile, was just my imagination amplifying ordinary sounds in an unfamiliar space. I didn't go check. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing until exhaustion pulled me under. The dishes in the kitchen were fine the next morning. Every plate, every cup, every bowl arranged in the cabinets exactly as I'd left them. I stood there for a long time, running my fingers along their smooth surfaces, feeling foolish. Sleep deprivation, I decided. The stress of the move. I made coffee and watched steam curl toward a ceiling where a water stain spread in a shape that, if I squinted, looked almost like a woman's profile. The second week brought the voices. They came from the bedroom adjacent to mine, the one I'd designated as a future office but hadn't yet furnished. Muffled at first like a radio playing in another apartment, bleeding through two thin walls. I pressed my ear to the shared wall and heard the unmistakable cadence of an argument. A man's voice, low and insistent, and beneath it, a woman's responses, sharp and wounded. The words were indistinct, but the emotional texture was perfectly clear. I knew that rhythm. I'd lived inside arguments like that for years. When I opened the door to the empty room, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Not the passive quiet of an unoccupied space, but an active, held-breath silence, as if something had just stopped speaking specifically because I was listening. I searched the room. I checked the windows, examined the walls for hidden speakers or vents that might carry sound from neighboring properties. The house was detached, sitting alone on its lot with at least 30 feet of overgrown garden separating it from the nearest structure. There were no neighbors close enough to hear. There was no rational explanation. That night, I heard a door slam somewhere on the ground floor. The sound was violent, percussive, the kind of slam that comes from genuine anger. I sat up in bed, heart pounding against my ribs, and listened. Footsteps followed, heavy, deliberate, crossing the hallway below and then ascending the stairs. They stopped outside my bedroom door. I didn't open it. I sat in the dark, watching the thin strip of light beneath the door, waiting for a shadow to break it. None came. When I finally gathered the courage to look, the hallway was empty, and every door in the house stood open, including the ones I was certain I'd closed. Sleep became something I rationed rather than enjoyed. I lay awake cataloging sounds, The creak of floorboards, the whisper of air through gaps I couldn't locate, the occasional distant crash from the kitchen that I'd stopped investigating because the dishes were always fine in the morning, always arranged in their neat rows, always untouched. The feeling of being watched settled over me like a second skin. It was strongest in the bathroom, where the mirror seemed to hold my reflection a half-second longer than it should when I turned away. It was present in the kitchen, where peripheral shadows darted just beyond the edge of my vision. It followed me through the house, this invisible pressure, this sense of eyes tracking my movements with patient, unwavering attention. I started leaving lights on. I started sleeping with the television murmuring in the corner, its blue glow a barrier against the dark. Neither helped. The bed incident began 3 weeks after I moved in. I woke to the sensation of weight settling onto the mattress beside me. A distinct depression, the kind made by a body lowering itself slowly, carefully, as if trying not to disturb. I was facing the wall, frozen, every muscle locked rigid. I felt the warmth of proximity without contact, the way you can sense another person's presence even with your eyes closed. And then, crying. Soft, broken sobs, muffled as if by hands pressed over a mouth. A woman's grief, raw and shapeless, pouring out inches from my ear. Between the sobs, words emerged, whispered, barely audible, thick with terror. He's still here. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The crying continued for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, the mattress dipping and shifting with the weight of sorrow I couldn't see. When it finally stopped, the weight lifted slowly, and I heard, or felt, something move toward the bedroom door. I didn't turn over until morning. When I did, the sheets on the other side of the bed were twisted, bunched, disturbed in exactly the way they would be if someone had been lying there. I called my sister. I told her about the noises, the voices, the weight on the bed. She listened with the patient concern of someone who had watched me spiral through my divorce, who knew the texture of my particular brand of anxiety. "Have you been sleeping?" she asked. "Eating? Taking care of yourself?" Her questions carried an implication I didn't want to examine. My own mental history wasn't exactly spotless. There had been the depressive episode after my marriage ended, the months of therapy, the careful reconstruction of a self that had fractured along familiar fault lines. I knew what she was really asking. I knew she was wondering if this was a relapse. The worst part was, I wondered too. I started documenting everything. I bought a notebook and recorded each incident with clinical precision. The date, the time, the exact nature of the disturbance. The footsteps that paced the upstairs hallway every night at 3 a.m. The whispered arguments that bled through the walls. The dishes I found rearranged in the morning. Not broken, never broken, but moved, shifted, placed in patterns I hadn't created. The cold spots that appeared without explanation. Concentrated patches of frigid air that seemed to follow me from room to room. Reading the entries back, I saw how it looked. I saw the portrait they painted of a man losing his grip, conjuring phantoms from stress and isolation. The handwriting grew more erratic as the weeks progressed, the descriptions more desperate. But the documentation also revealed something else. Patterns. The voices always argued about the same things. Money, trust, another woman's name I could never quite catch. The weight on the bed always appeared between 2 and 4 a.m. The footsteps always stopped at the same point in the hallway, just outside the door to the empty room I still couldn't bring myself to furnish. I began to feel that I was observing something rather than experiencing it, that these disturbances weren't meant for me at all. I was an audience to a tragedy that had already happened, watching scenes play out on a loop, bleeding through whatever membrane separates then from now. The neighbor found me sitting on my front steps at 6 a.m., wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. I hadn't slept in 2 days. The weight on the bed had come every night, heavier each time, the crying more desperate, the whispered warnings more urgent. He's still here. He's still here. He's still here. The neighbor was an older woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed. She brought me tea in a ceramic mug and sat beside me without asking permission. "You've seen her," she said. Not a question. My hands shook as I raised the mug to my lips. I didn't answer. The previous owner, she continued, watching my face carefully. Him and his wife. They fought constantly. The whole neighborhood heard. She was afraid of him. Anyone could see that. And then one day, she just wasn't there anymore. He said she left, packed her things in the middle of the night and disappeared. The tea had gone cold. I hadn't taken a single sip. No one believed him, the neighbor continued softly. We all thought, well, you hear stories about the things that happen behind closed doors, about the secrets houses keep. She looked at me then with something between pity and warning. He sold the house cheap because he couldn't stand to be in it anymore. Said he kept hearing her, kept feeling her at night, sitting beside him, crying. Said she wouldn't stop telling him that he was still there. My throat closed around words I couldn't form. The neighbor's eyes held mine. The question is, she said, who do you think she's warning? I'm writing this from the living room. It's 3 a.m. And the footsteps have started again, pacing, pacing the hallway above my head. The weight came earlier tonight, heavier than ever, the crying so close to my ear I could feel breath that wasn't there. The whisper has changed. The words have shifted. He's still here. He knows you can hear me. He knows you're listening. I've stopped trying to determine what's real. The boundary between haunting and psychosis has become meaningless. Either I'm sharing this house with echoes of something terrible, or I'm fragmenting in ways I can't control. And both possibilities lead to the same dark corridor. The neighbor's question haunts me more than any phantom. Who is she warning about? Is she speaking to whoever lives here? Whoever occupies this space that holds her like an insect in amber? Or is she speaking about whoever lives here? Is the presence she fears the previous owner imprinted on these walls like a bruise that won't fade? Or is it something else entirely? Something that was here before him, before any of them. Something that draws certain people to this house with its impossible price and its bad memories. I catch myself in mirrors now, staring, searching my own reflection for signs of something other. I've started to lose time, minutes here, an hour there. Gaps in my documentation where I don't remember what I was doing or where I was standing. Sometimes I wake on the stairs with no memory of leaving my bed. Sometimes I find my hands doing things without my permission. Opening doors, closing windows, arranging dishes in patterns that feel familiar, even though I've never learned them. The footsteps have stopped. The house has gone silent in that terrible, watching way. I just heard something in the hallway outside this room. A whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to understand. He's still here. And for the first time, I'm not certain which of us she means. Story 2. The smell hit me first, something between mildew and burnt sugar, a sweetness that clung to the back of my throat like a warning I chose to ignore. The apartment was small, barely 600 square feet of warped hardwood floors and walls that seemed to breathe when the radiator coughed to life. But the rent was impossibly low, almost offensively so, and I had learned long ago not to question good fortune when my bank account hovered perpetually near zero. The real estate agent moved through the space with the hurried efficiency of someone eager to complete an unpleasant task. He spoke quickly about the building's history, constructed in 1923, renovated twice, most recently in the 80s, while his eyes avoided mine with practiced precision. When I asked about the previous tenants, he paused at the window, his reflection ghostly against the gray afternoon light. They left without notice, he said. It happens sometimes. I should have pressed him. I should have asked why the rent was half the market rate, why the hallway lights flickered in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, why the building superintendent refused to meet my eyes when I passed him in the lobby. Instead, I signed the temporary lease and accepted the keys, their cold weight settling into my palm like a premonition. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked my meager belongings, arranged furniture that seemed to shrink against the apartment's cramped dimensions, and tried to convince myself that the persistent chill was merely poor insulation. The radiator worked in erratic bursts, filling the rooms with waves of dry heat that never quite penetrated the cold spots near the corners. At night, I would wake to the sound of settling pipes, the groaning of old wood, the distant murmur of traffic 7 floors below. Normal sounds, the sounds of any old building adjusting to a new occupant. It was on the 8th day that I discovered the first message. I had been repainting the bedroom wall. The previous color, a sickly yellow that reminded me of jaundiced skin, had begun to flake near the baseboard. As I scraped away the loose paint, my tool caught on something uneven beneath the surface. Letters emerged from under the yellow, carved into the plaster with what must have been a fingernail or the edge of a key, the marks deep enough to survive multiple coats of paint. Don't sign the final contract. I stood there for a long moment, the scraper trembling slightly in my hand. The logical part of my mind constructed reasonable explanations. A disgruntled former tenant, a joke, perhaps even my own imagination transforming random scratches into meaningful shapes. But my fingers traced the letters anyway, feeling their deliberate curves, the urgency embedded in each stroke. I painted over the message that evening. The fresh white coat covered it completely, though I found myself avoiding that section of wall, positioning my bed so I wouldn't have to face it while I slept. The second message appeared 3 days later, in the bathroom. I had been scrubbing the tile grout, a task I'd been avoiding since move-in, when I noticed discoloration behind the medicine cabinet. The cabinet came away from the wall with surprising ease, revealing a patch of exposed plaster covered in the same desperate handwriting. He only appears after the 3rd rent. My second rent payment had processed 2 days prior. I had 19 days until the 3rd. I began to research the building's history with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The public records revealed little. Construction permits, ownership transfers, the usual bureaucratic documentation of a century-old structure. No deaths were recorded within its walls, no scandals, no unexplained disappearances. The building existed in a kind of historical vacuum, unremarkable in every measurable way. And yet, I started noticing things, small inconsistencies that accumulated like dust in the corners of my perception. The elevator, when it worked, would sometimes stop between floors for exactly 3 seconds before continuing. Always 3, never more, never less. The hallway outside my door contained 14 overhead lights, but I could only ever count 13 when I walked its length, no matter how carefully I tracked each fixture. The building superintendent, a heavy-set man with hands like weathered leather, would appear in the lobby at precise intervals throughout the day, always facing the same direction, always wearing the same expression of patient anticipation. I told myself I was being paranoid. Stress from the move, perhaps, or the isolation of living alone in a new city. I called my sister. She lived 3 states away and worried about me constantly, and listened to her voice without really hearing her words. She asked if I was sleeping well. I told her yes, because the alternative would have required explanations I couldn't provide. The footsteps began on the 15th day. At first they were barely audible, a soft rhythm in the hallway outside my door, the kind of sound that could easily be dismissed as a neighbor returning home late. But they continued past my apartment, then returned, then passed again, establishing a pattern that repeated throughout the night. Back and forth, the measured tread of someone pacing with purpose. I opened my door once, around 3 in the morning, and found the hallway empty. The footsteps had stopped the instant my hand touched the doorknob. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, pregnant with a presence I could feel, but not see. I stood in my doorway for what felt like hours, staring at the flickering lights, counting them over and over. 13. Always 13. I stopped sleeping properly after that. The footsteps came every night now, growing bolder, coming closer. Sometimes they would pause directly outside my door, and I would lie rigid in my bed, barely breathing, waiting for the knock that never came. The temperature in the apartment dropped, despite the radiator's constant groaning, and I began wearing layers even indoors, my breath occasionally visible in the cold air near the corners. My co-workers noticed the change. My supervisor asked if everything was all right at home, her concern genuine but distant, the polite worry of someone who didn't really want to know the answer. I assured her I was fine, just adjusting to the new place, and she accepted the explanation with visible relief. I had become skilled at constructing normalcy from fragments of pretense. The third rent payment was due in 4 days when I found the final message. I hadn't been looking for it. I had, in fact, been trying very hard not to look at the walls at all, to move through my apartment with my eyes fixed on safe spaces, the floor, the ceiling, the window that faced nothing but gray sky. But the corner of the living room had begun to bulge slightly, the wallpaper separating from the plaster beneath, and some compulsion I couldn't name drew me toward it. The paper peeled away easily, too easily, as if it had been waiting for my touch. Behind it, covering nearly the entire corner from floor to ceiling, words crowded together in frantic clusters, the handwriting increasingly erratic as it climbed higher. Names, dozens of them, written in different hands, different styles, spanning what must have been decades. Beneath each name, a date. Beneath each date, the same 2 words repeated like a litany. Still here. I don't remember falling. I came back to myself on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold hardwood, staring at the baseboard where more words had been scratched into the wood itself, smaller than the others, almost invisible unless you knew to look. We never left. The footsteps in the hallway had stopped. In the silence, I became aware of another sound, breathing, soft and patient, coming from somewhere behind me. I couldn't turn my head. My body had become a foreign thing, unresponsive to my increasingly frantic commands. I lay there, listening to that measured respiration, feeling the temperature drop around me degree by degree. When I finally managed to move, hours or minutes later, the apartment was empty. The wallpaper had reattached itself to the corner, smooth and undisturbed as if I had never touched it. I scrambled to my feet and tore at the paper, searching for the names, the dates, the evidence of what I had seen. The wall beneath was blank, fresh plaster, unmarked and white, and I called my landlord the next morning. The woman who answered spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone managing too many properties, too many tenants, too many complaints. I asked about the previous occupants, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. She consulted her records and told me the apartment had been vacant for 3 years before I moved in. That's impossible, I said. Someone was here. Someone left messages. She assured me I was the first tenant since the last renovation. The previous occupant had simply stopped paying rent and disappeared, leaving no forwarding address, no explanation, nothing but an empty apartment and an expired lease. I asked about the occupant before that. She put me on hold. When she returned, her voice had changed, becoming careful and measured in a way that made my skin crawl. "Our records don't go back that far," she said. "Is there anything else I can help you with? I have 2 days until my third rent payment. The footsteps have stopped completely now, replaced by something worse. A silence so complete it feels like pressure against my eardrums, like the building itself is holding its breath. I find myself avoiding the corners of my apartment, those cold spots where the temperature drops and the shadows seem to gather with purpose. Last night, I woke to find my bedroom door open, though I distinctly remember locking it before bed. The hallway beyond was dark, darker than it should have been with the emergency lighting that usually glowed green near the stairwell. I lay in bed and watched that darkness, waiting for something to emerge from it, certain that at any moment I would see movement, a shape, a face. Nothing came. Nothing ever comes. That's the worst part. The anticipation without resolution, the fear without confirmation. I am beginning to wonder if the messages were ever real, if the names on the wall were anything more than shadows cast by my deteriorating mind. The superintendent smiled at me this morning, a knowing expression that might have been friendly, or might have been something else entirely, and I couldn't bring myself to smile back. I've drafted an email to my landlord requesting to break my lease. It sits in my outbox, unsent, while I debate whether I'm overreacting, whether I'm allowing fear to dictate decisions I'll regret. The apartment is so cheap. The location is so convenient. Everything about this situation can be explained rationally if I'm willing to make the necessary assumptions about my own mental state. The final contract sits on my kitchen counter, delivered yesterday by a courier who wouldn't meet my eyes. All it requires is my signature and the third rent payment, and the apartment will be mine for another year. I pick up the pen sometimes, in weak moments, telling myself that signing is the reasonable choice, that the alternative, admitting something is wrong, facing the possibility that I've imagined everything, is worse than whatever might be waiting. The footsteps have started again as I write this, but they're not in the hallway anymore. They're inside the walls. I can hear them moving through the building's bones, tracing paths between the apartments, circling closer with each pass. Sometimes they stop directly behind me, separated from my back by mere inches of plaster, and I feel what might be breath against the nape of my neck, cold and patient and impossibly close. Tomorrow is the third rent payment. I haven't decided yet whether I'll make it, but I've noticed something strange about my reflection in the bathroom mirror, a hesitation in its movements, a fraction of a second where it doesn't quite match my own. I've started avoiding mirrors entirely, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor when I brush my teeth, refusing to look at any reflective surface after dark, because I'm no longer certain the face looking back is mine. And somewhere, in the walls, in the corners, in the cold spaces where the light doesn't reach, someone is waiting. Someone who has always been here. Someone who remembers every tenant who came before me, every name scratched desperately into plaster, every warning that went unheeded. The contract is still unsigned, the pen is still in my hand, and the breathing behind me has grown louder. Story 3. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper with character. What she meant was that the house sat at the end of a dirt road so neglected that my sedan scraped its undercarriage twice before I reached the property. What she meant was that the nearest neighbor lived a quarter-mile away, and the silence out here pressed against your eardrums like a held breath. What she meant, I would come to understand, was that no one in their right mind would pay full price for a place like this. I paid anyway. The price was obscene, barely more than a used car, and I told myself that desperation has a way of creating opportunity. My divorce had gutted my savings. The apartment in the city had become a coffin of memories. I needed walls that didn't remember her voice, floors that hadn't absorbed the echo of our arguments. This house, with its peeling white paint and overgrown yard, promised exactly that. A fresh start, wrapped in cheap square footage. The first wrong thing I noticed was small. The mailbox at the end of the driveway still had letters inside, advertisements, mostly. Their ink faded to ghostly pastels by months of sun and rain. One envelope near the bottom bore a handwritten address. The paper had softened with moisture and time, the words bleeding into illegibility. I threw them all away without reading them. They weren't mine. They belonged to whoever had lived here before, the family that had, according to the realtor's vague explanation, relocated suddenly. I met my nearest neighbor on that first afternoon. She emerged from between the trees that separated our properties like something summoned, a woman somewhere past 70 with eyes the color of creek water and hands that never stopped moving, adjusting her collar, smoothing her apron, picking at invisible threads on her sleeves. She introduced herself with a nod rather than a name, and when I mentioned that I'd just bought the place, her restless fingers went still. She told me the family had left for a trip, just packed up one day and drove off. She said they never came back, and when she said it, her gaze drifted past me toward the house, settling on the second-floor windows with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pity, perhaps, or warning. I asked if she knew where they'd gone. She shook her head, already turning away. Her final words hung in the humid air like a scent. Some places keep what's left behind. The interior of the house confirmed what the exterior had promised. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed only by my footprints as I moved from room to room. The furniture remained, a couch with floral upholstery, a dining table with 4 chairs, a television so old it still had knobs. I found a calendar on the kitchen wall, frozen on a month 3 years past. Someone had circled a date in red marker, the 15th. No notation, no explanation. Just a circle, emphatic and unexplained. The dishes were the first thing that truly unsettled me. They sat in the sink, crusted with the residue of a meal long since rotted and dried. 3 plates, 3 glasses. A pot on the stove held something that had once been soup, now a desiccated brown crust clinging to the metal. The smell had faded years ago, but my mind supplied it anyway. That sweet, sick odor of food left too long in summer heat. In the living room, I found toys scattered across a braided rug. A wooden train with faded red paint. Building blocks arranged in a pattern that might have been a house or might have been nothing. A stuffed rabbit, gray with dust, slumped against the leg of the couch as though placed there by careful hands and then abandoned. I gathered them into a cardboard box, my skin prickling with each touch. They felt heavier than they should have, weighted with the residue of play interrupted. Upstairs, the wrongness intensified. The master bedroom held clothes still folded on the bed, shirts, pants, a woman's dress laid out as if someone had been deciding what to pack. The closet stood open, hangers pushed aside, gaps in the row of garments suggesting items removed in haste. But the dresser drawers remained full. The bathroom still held toothbrushes in a ceramic cup, bristles splayed and brittle. The other bedrooms, 2 of them, doors standing open to the hallway, held more evidence of sudden departure. I didn't linger in those rooms. The smallness of the beds, the faded posters on the walls, the abandoned belongings scattered across every surface made my stomach turn in ways I couldn't explain. I closed those doors and told myself I'd deal with them later, clear them out, make the space my own. That first night I slept on the couch downstairs. The master bedroom felt wrong, and I wasn't ready to confront it. I lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me, the creak of old wood, the tick of pipes, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames. Normal sounds, explicable sounds. I repeated this to myself until I almost believed it. The voice came just after 3 in the morning. It was soft, so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A whisper that seemed to drift down the staircase like cold air, carrying words I couldn't quite parse. I lay rigid, my heart a fist pounding against my ribs, and strained to hear. The sound faded, replaced by silence so complete it felt deliberate. I didn't sleep again that night. The following days established a pattern. Daylight brought rationality. I cleaned, I scrubbed, I hauled bags of abandoned belongings to the curb, even though no garbage truck would come down this road. I told myself the house was just a house, the circumstances of its vacancy just an unfortunate mystery. The realtor had mentioned something about estate proceedings, legal complications, heirs who never materialized. It happened. People vanished from their lives all the time, but the nights refused to cooperate with my explanations. The whispers returned on the 3rd night, clearer now. I woke to the sound of murmuring from somewhere above me, a susurrus of voices too faint to understand but too persistent to ignore. I climbed the stairs with my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness, my free hand trailing along the wall for balance. The closed doors at the end of the hallway seemed to pulse with shadow, seemed to breathe in the unsteady light. I pressed my ear to the wood. The sound stopped immediately, as though whatever made it had been listening for my approach. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers, expectant, patient, aware. I returned to the couch and lay there until dawn, watching the ceiling, waiting for something I couldn't name. The distortions began subtly. I would enter a room and find objects moved, not dramatically, not in ways I could prove, but shifted. The wooden train I'd boxed up appeared on the kitchen counter. The stuffed rabbit materialized on the bottom step of the staircase, positioned as though descending. I told myself I'd move these things myself, that memory was fallible, that the stress of relocation and divorce had fragmented my attention. But the explanations rang hollow, even as I spoke them aloud into the empty rooms. The sensation of being watched grew impossible to ignore. It prickled at the back of my neck while I washed dishes, tightened my shoulders while I read in the evenings, sent me spinning toward doorways, certain I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision. The house had no mirrors. I'd noticed this early on, found it strange, filed it away. Now the absence felt intentional, as though something in this place didn't want to be seen or didn't want me to see myself. I began sleeping poorly, then barely at all. The whispers came every night now, always in the small hours, always from those closed rooms upstairs. I stopped investigating. I would lie on the couch and listen as the sounds waxed and waned, sometimes resolving into what almost sounded like words. Please, don't. Here. The fragments assembled themselves into pleas I refused to fully comprehend. On the seventh night, I heard the words clearly for the first time. The voice drifted down the staircase like smoke, weightless and pervasive, and it said, "Don't forget us here." I visited my neighbor the next morning. She was hanging laundry in her yard, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task done 10,000 times. I asked her about the family again, how many had lived there, when exactly they'd left, whether she'd seen the car drive away. Her hands paused on a clothespin. She told me there had been a father and a mother and others. She said they'd seemed happy enough, though she hadn't known them well. The father had worked in the city, commuted every day down that terrible road. The mother had gardened, planted tomatoes that still grew wild in the backyard, choked now with weeds. They'd left one morning in summer, she said, all of them together. She'd seen the car pull out of the driveway and head toward the main road. I asked if anyone had investigated, if anyone had looked for them. She resumed hanging laundry, her voice flat. The house sat empty, she said. The years passed. Eventually someone put it up for sale. That was all she knew. That was all anyone knew. I walked back to my property with her words circling my thoughts. All of them together. I tried to picture it. A family loading suitcases, climbing into a car, driving toward a vacation they'd never take. But the image kept splintering, kept fracturing against the evidence I'd found inside. The dishes, the clothes laid out, the toys positioned as though in the middle of play. People didn't leave like that, not for a trip, not voluntarily. The paranoia took root in the second week, growing tendrils through every moment of my waking hours. I began checking the locks obsessively, circling the house at dusk to peer into shadows, starting at sounds I couldn't identify. The whispers had become a nightly constant, but now I heard other things too. Footsteps in rooms I wasn't occupying, the creak of weight on floorboards overhead, the soft thump of something falling. Every time I investigated, I found nothing. Empty rooms, settled dust, silence that felt like held breath. I stopped opening those doors upstairs. I couldn't say why exactly. The dread had grown too heavy, too specific. I would stand in the hallway and feel certain, irrationally, impossibly certain, that something waited on the other side, something that wanted me to open the door, something that had been waiting for a very long time. My sleep collapsed entirely. I would doze for minutes at a time, jerking awake at phantom sounds, my body rigid with adrenaline. In the mornings, I found evidence of my own movements that I couldn't remember making. Dishes washed and stacked, furniture rearranged. Once I woke to find myself standing at the bottom of the staircase, my hand on the banister, my bare feet cold against the wood floor. I had no memory of getting up, no memory of walking across the room. I had been dreaming of voices, of small hands tugging at my sleeve, of pleas I couldn't understand. The line between sleeping and waking blurred. The line between memory and imagination dissolved. I began to question every perception, every sensation, every thought that surfaced in my fragmenting mind. Was I hearing whispers, or was I manufacturing them from the white noise of solitude? Were objects moving, or was I moving them myself and forgetting? Was the house haunted, or was I? I couldn't answer. I still can't. The final night began like all the others. I lay on the couch in darkness, listening to the house breathe around me, waiting for the whispers to start. They came at 3, as always, that soft murmuring from above, those half-formed words that slipped through my comprehension like water through fingers. But this time they grew louder. The voices rose in volume and intensity, layering over each other, becoming a chorus of desperate pleas that filled the house like floodwater. Don't forget us. Please don't forget us here. The words battered against my ears, against my mind, until I couldn't tell if I was hearing them, or thinking them, or screaming them myself. I climbed the stairs. I don't remember deciding to do it. My body moved without my consent, drawn upward by something stronger than fear. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the closed doors at its end pulsing with shadow. The voices grew clearer with each step. Not one voice, not two, but several, overlapping, begging in unison. My hand closed around the doorknob. The metal was cold, so cold it burned. I opened the door. The room beyond was empty. Moonlight fell through the window onto bare walls, bare floors, bare shelves stripped of every object I'd seen days before. No toys, no furniture, no evidence that anyone had ever occupied this space. But in the dust on the floor, dust I knew I'd cleaned, dust I'd scrubbed away with my own hands, there were footprints, small ones, so many of them, circling the room endlessly, wearing paths into the gray film, overlapping and crisscrossing in patterns that made no sense. And on the wall, written in what looked like finger-drawn lines through the dust, were words I will never forget. "We are still here. You promised you wouldn't leave." I backed out of the room. I closed the door. I walked down the stairs and out of the house and sat in my car until morning, shaking, watching the windows for movement I never saw. I'm writing this from a motel room 30 miles away. I haven't been back to the house in 4 days. I tell myself I'll return eventually, to collect my things, to put it up for sale, to close this chapter of my life. But every time I think about that door, about those footprints in dust that shouldn't have been there, about that message addressed to someone who wasn't me, my hands start trembling and my vision blurs at the edges. The realtor calls every day. She wants to know if I'm satisfied with my purchase. She wants to know if there's anything she can help with. I don't answer. I've started hearing whispers here too. Faint, almost inaudible. Probably just the ventilation system, the hum of the ice machine outside my door, the murmur of televisions through thin walls, probably just my mind manufacturing sounds from silence, still trapped in patterns established during those sleepless nights. Probably. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the words clearly. And I wonder if the family ever really left that house at all. I wonder if something in that place collects what stays behind. Not bodies, but something else. Something that lingers. Something that waits. I wonder if I left something behind too. I wonder if it's calling me back. Story 4. The photographs lied. I understood this within seconds of stepping out of my car, gravel crunching beneath boots I'd bought specifically for this new chapter of my life. In the listing, the cabin had glowed with honeyed light, windows like warm eyes beckoning travelers home. But standing here now, watching the afternoon sun strain to illuminate the weathered wooden walls, everything seemed dimmer, as if someone had adjusted the saturation of reality itself, draining it to something pale and unconvincing. The mountain air carried a chill that the late September forecast hadn't mentioned. I pulled my jacket tighter and approached the gate, where a hand-painted sign announced the property's name, Mountain's Rest. The letters were fresh, a cheerful forest green against cream-colored wood. But something about the sign's texture caught my attention, a slight unevenness, a topography of history beneath the new paint. I ran my thumb across the surface and felt the ridges of previous incarnations, names buried under names, identities shed like snakeskin. The owner had explained during our brief phone call that he'd like to refresh the property between tenants. A new coat of paint here, updated fixtures there, a new name to mark new beginnings. I'd found it charming then, evidence of care and attention. Now standing before this layered sign, I felt something else entirely. Something I couldn't name but that settled into my stomach like a stone dropped into still water. The first week passed in the mechanical blur of unpacking and adjustment. The cabin was small but sufficient. A main room that served as living space and kitchen, a bedroom barely large enough for the mattress I'd brought, and a bathroom with plumbing that groaned like something ancient being roused from sleep. Every surface carried a faint chemical smell, fresh paint, new sealant, industrial cleaner, attempting to mask something older and more organic underneath. I told myself the shadows were normal. Mountain cabins have shadows. The sun sets earlier here, blocked by peaks that seemed to lean closer each evening. The way light pooled in corners and left others perpetually dim was simply architecture, not intention, but I couldn't explain why certain shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, or why the bedroom always felt 3 degrees colder than the rest of the cabin, regardless of how I adjusted the ancient heating system, or why on my 4th night, I woke at 3:47 a.m. to the absolute certainty that someone was standing in the corner of the room watching. There was no one there. Of course there was no one there. I checked every room, every closet, even stepped outside to scan the tree line with my phone's flashlight. Nothing but pine and darkness and my own ragged breathing forming clouds in the cold air. Sleep didn't return that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee I'd made too strong, and noticed for the first time the marks on the wooden floor near the bedroom door. Scratches. Dozens of them, running in parallel lines as if something, or someone, had been dragged. The fresh polyurethane coating had filled them in, made them smooth to the touch, but the overhead light caught their edges and illuminated a history I hadn't been meant to see. My nearest neighbor lived half a mile down the mountain road, in a house that seemed to grow organically from the hillside. He was an older man, weathered in the way people become when they've spent decades arguing with difficult soil and harsher winters. I met him during my 2nd week, when I'd walked too far in unfamiliar terrain and found myself uncertain of which trail led home. He studied me with pale eyes that seemed to absorb more than they reflected. When I mentioned where I was staying, his expression shifted, just slightly, a tightening around the mouth that he quickly suppressed. The cabin had been empty for almost a year before I'd arrived, he told me. The previous tenant had left suddenly, in the middle of the night, abandoning most of his belongings. Before him, a woman had lasted 6 months. Before her, a couple who'd stayed only 3 weeks before breaking their lease and disappearing down the mountain. He recited these facts in the flat tone of someone describing weather patterns, inevitable and beyond question. I asked if he knew why people left. He looked past me, toward the direction of my cabin, though it was invisible through the trees. Some places, he said, don't want to be lived in. Then he gave me directions home and retreated inside without saying goodbye. That night I found myself scraping at the gate sign with my car key. Layer by layer I revealed the cabin's previous names. Serenity, Fresh Start, New Dawn, all the optimistic nomenclature of escape, of second chances. And beneath them all, in letters that seemed somehow darker than simple paint, the original name emerged. Last Chance. My hand was shaking, though I couldn't remember when it had started. The sounds began during week 3, subtle at first, creaking that could have been settling wood, whispers that might have been wind finding gaps in old window frames. But they organized themselves gradually, taking on patterns and rhythms that seemed almost deliberate. Footsteps in the attic space I'd assumed was too shallow for anyone to occupy. Breathing that seemed to come from inside the walls. And once, in the gray light before dawn, what sounded unmistakably like my own name, spoken in a voice I almost recognized. I stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. Food lost its appeal, its texture and taste becoming somehow distant, as if I were experiencing it through layers of gauze. My reflection in the bathroom mirror developed shadows under its eyes that seemed deeper each morning, and occasionally, just occasionally, it seemed to move half a second after I did, playing catch-up with reality. The landlord didn't answer my calls. I left voicemails describing the sounds, the temperature fluctuations, the persistent feeling of being observed. No response came. When I drove to the address listed on my lease, a property management office in the nearest town, I found an empty storefront with sun-bleached paper covering the windows. The neighboring business owner told me the office had been vacant for years, decades maybe. She looked at me strangely when I showed her the lease with its official letterhead and signatures. I began documenting everything. Photographs of the scratched floors, the layered sign, the shadows that seem to occupy spaces they shouldn't, videos of the sounds, though they never seem to record properly, always just beneath audibility, lost in static and ambient noise. I filled a notebook with timestamps and observations, my handwriting degrading page by page into something cramped and frantic. Reading through these notes now, I can see where I started referring to the cabin as if it were conscious, where I began capitalizing it in certain passages, where I stopped distinguishing between what I'd seen and what I might have dreamed. The breakthrough, or breakdown, depending on perspective, came on a Tuesday night during my 6th week. I'd been awake for 40 hours, sustained by coffee and the particular electricity of profound unease, when I noticed the wall behind my bed had developed a new stain. Number not developed. Revealed. The fresh paint was bubbling slightly, moisture from somewhere seeping through, and beneath the peeling surface I could see markings. Not random water damage. Words. I spent hours carefully peeling back the paint, using a butter knife and fingernails and eventually my bare hands when precision stopped mattering. Layer after layer came away, revealing messages from previous tenants written directly on the wood, dates and names and fragments of thought, a palimpsest of desperation. It watches from the corner. Can't sleep. It knows when I sleep. Day 23. Still here. Still waiting. Don't trust the... This one was incomplete. The final word obscured by what looked like a burn mark. It just wants company. And finally, in handwriting, I recognized with sick certainty as my own, though I had no memory of writing it. I never left. My hands were raw and bleeding. The cabin had gone completely silent. No creaking, no whispers, no sounds at all except my own ragged breathing. Even the wind outside had stopped, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I ran to the bedroom door and found it locked from the outside. I'm still here. I don't know how many days have passed since that night. Time has become unreliable, measured only by periods of light and dark that seem to stretch and compress according to their own logic. The door unlocked eventually, or perhaps I only imagined it had been locked in the first place. The messages on the wall were gone when I looked again, covered by paint that showed no evidence of being disturbed. My car won't start. The engine turns over but never catches, as if something essential has been removed. My phone shows full signal but calls never connect, texts never send, and the internet delivers only cached versions of pages I visited weeks ago. The neighbor hasn't been outside when I've walked past his house. The curtains are always drawn. Once I thought I saw him watching from an upstairs window, but when I raised my hand to wave, the figure withdrew into darkness. I've started talking to the cabin. This seems reasonable now, in a way it wouldn't have seemed reasonable before. If it can watch, if it can want, perhaps it can understand. Perhaps that's what it's waiting for. Not victims, but companions. Not prey, but guests who finally acknowledge their host. I found a new name buried under the layers on the gate sign, beneath even last chance. I don't know how I missed it before. The letters are faded almost to invisibility, but in the right light, at the right angle, they resolve into something that might be a word. Home. Or perhaps that's only what I want to see. The paint has become difficult to read, the layers bleeding into each other until no single truth remains. Only interpretations. Only possibilities. The sounds have stopped. The shadows stay where they belong. The temperature has normalized, and my reflection moves precisely when I do, not before, not after. These improvements should comfort me, but instead they feel like the silence between lightning and thunder, a held breath before something inevitable arrives. I've stopped trying to leave. The mountain roads confuse me now. Every turn leading back to the cabin. Every trail depositing me at the gate with its layered sign. Perhaps I've forgotten how to navigate terrain I once understood. Perhaps the geography has rearranged itself while I wasn't paying attention. Perhaps there never was a road out. At night, when the darkness presses against the windows with almost physical weight, I lie awake and listen to the breathing inside the walls. It sounds like my own. It might be my own. The distinction has lost meaning. Tomorrow, I'll repaint the sign. A fresh name for a fresh start. That's what tenants do here, I think. They rename and repaint and convince themselves they're in control, that they're staying by choice, that the door will open whenever they want to walk through it. The owner will understand. The owner always understands. I just need to remember who the owner is. Story 5. The lease was cheap enough to make me suspicious, but desperation has a way of silencing doubt. $300 a month for a studio in the heart of the city. The kind of deal that doesn't exist unless something is profoundly wrong. I signed the papers without asking questions, ignoring the water stains on the ceiling, the faint smell of something organic trapped beneath layers of cheap paint, the way the afternoon light seemed to die the moment it crossed the threshold. The doorman was a heavy-set man with nicotine-stained fingers and a laugh that sounded like gravel scraping against glass. When I told him which unit I'd rented, he paused mid-cigarette, smoke curling around his weathered face like a shroud. He said something about nobody lasting more than 2 nights there, chuckling as if sharing an inside joke I wasn't privy to. I asked him what he meant, but he just shrugged, stubbed out his cigarette against the brick wall, and told me to have a good stay. The way he emphasized good made my skin prickle. The studio itself was unremarkable in its decay. 1,200 square feet of warped hardwood floors, a kitchenette with appliances that hummed in frequencies that felt wrong, and a single window overlooking the alley where the neighboring building's air conditioning units dripped a constant rhythm onto the fire escape below. The bed came with the unit, a queen-sized mattress wrapped in plastic that crinkled when I sat on it, releasing a faint odor of disinfectant and something else, something sweeter, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. The first night passed without incident. I unpacked my single suitcase, arranged my toiletries in the bathroom cabinet with the cracked mirror, and fell asleep to the distant sound of traffic and the irregular dripping from the alley. My dreams were formless, gray, the kind of sleep that feels more like a temporary absence than actual rest. When I woke, pale morning light filtered through the grimy window, and I felt nothing more than the mild disorientation of sleeping in an unfamiliar place. I spent the day exploring the neighborhood, finding a coffee shop 3 blocks away where the barista had tired eyes and a mechanical smile, a laundromat that smelled of industrial soap and loneliness, a convenience store where the fluorescent lights buzzed with the insistence of trapped insects. When I returned to the studio that evening, I noticed for the first time how the hallway lights flickered in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, as if something was testing them, learning their rhythm. The second night began like the first. I showered in water that ran lukewarm at best, the pressure inconsistent, sputtering and gasping through pipes that groaned within the walls, like the building itself was digesting something. I dried myself with a towel that never quite lost its dampness no matter how long I left it hanging, dressed in worn sweatpants and a t-shirt soft from years of washing, and climbed into the plastic-wrapped bed. The mattress crinkled beneath me, a sound like whispered secrets, and I pulled the thin blanket up to my chin despite the room's oppressive warmth. Sleep came slowly, reluctantly, like an animal approaching an outstretched hand with suspicion. I don't know what time it was when I first noticed it. The room was dark save for the orange glow of streetlights bleeding through the window, casting long shadows across the ceiling that moved with the passing of cars below. I lay on my back, staring at those shadows, feeling the heaviness of near sleep pressing down on my chest, when I became aware of a sound, breathing, not my own. I held my breath to be certain, and still it continued, a soft, wet sound, like air being drawn through a constricted throat, coming from somewhere beside the bed. Close. Too close. I could feel the faintest disturbance in the air, a warmth that didn't belong, brushing against my exposed forearm like the exhalation of something alive. My heart began to pound, a violent percussion against my ribs that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I told myself it was the pipes, the building settling, the echo of my own pulse reverberating through the cheap mattress. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to count backward from 100, to anchor myself in rationality. The breathing accelerated. It matched my heart rate, beat for beat, breath for breath, as if whatever was making that sound could sense my fear, could taste it in the stale air between us. I squeezed my eyes tighter, and the breathing grew faster still, more urgent, more desperate, the wet rasp of it filling my ears until I could hear nothing else. I opened my eyes. The breathing stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to look toward the side of the bed where the sound had originated. The shadows on the ceiling continued their silent dance, indifferent to my terror. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I slipped into a sleep plagued by dreams of drowning in black water while something circled beneath me, never touching, only watching. The third morning arrived gray and heavy, the sky outside the window the color of old bruises. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the building around me, the distant clang of pipes, the muffled footsteps of neighbors I never saw, the persistent dripping from the alley below. I tried to convince myself that what I'd heard was a dream, a hypnagogic hallucination born from stress and unfamiliarity. People hear things when they're falling asleep. It's documented, scientific, normal. I didn't believe myself. I spent the day outside the studio, unable to bear the thought of being within those walls while daylight lasted. I walked until my feet ached, sat in the coffee shop until the barista's mechanical smile began to falter with each refill, wandered through a park where the trees stood bare and skeletal against the overcast sky. When evening came, I stood outside my building for nearly 30 minutes, watching the windows of my floor, half expecting to see something looking back. There was nothing, just glass, reflecting the dying light. The doorman wasn't at his post when I entered. The lobby was empty, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly pallor that made my skin look jaundiced. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight, counting the flights like a condemned man counting the days until execution. The door to my studio looked the same as when I'd left it. The same peeling paint, the same tarnished brass numbers, the same faint smell of mildew seeping through the cracks. But when I inserted my key and turned it, I felt a resistance that hadn't been there before, as if something on the other side was pressing against the door, leaning its weight into the frame. The door opened to an empty room. I entered slowly, scanning the shadows, checking the corners, the bathroom, the closet that was too shallow to hide anything larger than a coat. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My toiletries in the cabinet, my suitcase against the wall, the bed with its plastic-wrapped mattress, sheets twisted from my restless sleep the night before. But the air felt different, heavier, charged with an expectation I couldn't name. I didn't want to sleep. I sat in the single chair by the window, watching the alley below, watching the shadows lengthen and merge as night consumed the city. I turned on every light in the studio, banishing the darkness to the corners where it pooled like oil, waiting. I drank coffee from the pot I'd bought at the convenience store, bitter and burnt, until my hands trembled and my thoughts raced in circles that led nowhere. Eventually, inevitably, my body betrayed me. My eyes grew heavy despite the caffeine, my muscles slack with exhaustion. I told myself I would just rest my eyes for a moment, just close them for a second, just. The breathing began immediately, closer this time, not beside the bed but beside me, beside the chair, so close I could feel the heat of it against my cheek. My eyes flew open, and I saw nothing. The room was empty. The lights still blazed, the shadows still cowered in their corners. But the breathing continued, wet and ragged and hungry, coming from a space that should have been empty. That was empty, that I could see was empty. I stood so quickly the chair toppled backward, crashing against the hardwood floor with a sound that echoed through the studio like a gunshot. The breathing stopped. I spun in a slow circle, searching for the source, finding only air and light in the distant hum of the refrigerator. My hands were shaking. My breath came in short, sharp gasps that fogged in the air before me. The room had grown cold, impossibly cold, despite the radiator clanking steadily in the corner. I could see my exhale crystallizing in the light, white plumes that dissipated into nothingness. And then I noticed the second plume. Beside me, perhaps 2 feet away, where nothing stood, where nothing could stand. A column of fog formed with each wet breath I could still hear but no longer wanted to acknowledge. I watched, paralyzed as the fog appeared and disappeared in a rhythm that had nothing to do with my own lungs. Each exhalation hanging in the frozen air like proof of something impossible. Something that was there, that was right there, that I could not see but could not deny. I ran. I don't remember leaving the studio, don't remember descending the stairs, don't remember bursting through the lobby doors into the cold night air. I found myself on the sidewalk, gasping, my bare feet numb against the concrete, wearing only my sweatpants and thin t-shirt. I stood there for a long time, staring up at the window of my studio, watching for movement, for a shape, for anything that might confirm I wasn't losing my mind. The window remained dark. I'd turned off the lights. I knew I had turned on every light. I knew this with the certainty of someone who had done it deliberately, obsessively, checking each switch twice. But the window was dark now, a black rectangle against the building's facade. And as I watched, I saw something press against the glass from the inside. Not a hand, not a face, just pressure, a distortion in the glass, as if something was leaning against it, looking down at me, watching. The doorman found me the next morning, still standing on the sidewalk, shivering in the gray dawn light. He didn't seem surprised. He asked if I'd made it to 3 nights, and when I didn't answer, he nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. He said the last tenant had made it to 4, but she'd stopped speaking after that. Spent 2 weeks in the hospital before she could tell anyone what happened. She never did tell anyone. She still can't. I asked him what was in that room. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and told me that nothing was in the room. That was the problem. Nothing was in the room, and nothing was very, very hungry. I left that morning, packed my single suitcase with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, walked out without looking back, without canceling the lease, without asking for my deposit. I'm writing this from a motel room 30 miles outside the city, a room with thin walls and stained carpet and a door that locks from the inside with a chain I've checked 17 times. It's almost midnight now. I've left all the lights on. I've stuffed towels under the door. I've convinced myself, almost, that whatever was in that studio stays in that studio, that it's bound to those walls, that it can't follow. But I can hear it now, that wet, ragged breathing, just beside the bed, just out of sight. Accelerating, always accelerating, every time I close my eyes. And I'm no longer certain of anything, whether the sound is coming from outside me or from within, whether I left the studio or brought something with me, whether the thing that breathes in the darkness has always been here, patient and hungry, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to listen, waiting for me to finally understand that the space beside me has never, not once in my entire life, been as empty as I believed. I won't sleep tonight. I'm afraid of what I might hear if I do. I'm more afraid of what I might see if I open my eyes. Story 6. The landlord's handshake was damp. I remember that detail now, though at the time I attributed it to the August heat, to nerves, to anything reasonable. He was an older man with eyes that never quite settled on my face, always drifting past my shoulder as if tracking something behind me. When he mentioned the house's history, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and I had to lean closer to hear him say that the previous tenants had experienced strange problems. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. The rent was half what I'd been paying for my cramped apartment downtown, and I was desperate enough to let vague warnings dissolve into the excitement of finally having space, silence, a place entirely my own. The first week passed without incident. The house was old but solid, built sometime in the 1940s with thick plaster walls that muffled the outside world into a distant hum. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and settled into the particular rhythm of solitary living. My wife had left 8 months earlier. Not dramatically, not with screaming or slammed doors, but with a quiet resignation that felt worse. She'd said I was becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone who stared too long at shadows and flinched at sounds only I could hear. I told myself the new house would be a fresh start, a chance to prove to myself that I was still the rational man I'd always believed myself to be. It was on the 9th day that I found the first puddle. I had just returned from work, the evening light casting long, amber rectangles across the hardwood floor, when I noticed it. A small pool of water near the living room window. Not clear water, but murky, carrying the faint brown tint of rust or old pipes. I crouched beside it, pressing my fingertips to the liquid. Cold, impossibly cold, as if it had been drawn from some deep underground place where sunlight never reached. I looked up at the ceiling, searching for signs of a leak, but the plaster was smooth and dry. The window was closed, sealed tight against the humidity outside. I cleaned it up with paper towels and told myself it was condensation, some quirk of the old house's ventilation system. But when I brought the towels to my nose, there was a smell, faint, organic, like standing water in a forgotten drain, like something that had been still for too long. 3 days later, another puddle appeared in the hallway outside my bedroom, then one in the kitchen, forming a nearly perfect circle on the linoleum. They always came when I wasn't looking, as if the house was waiting for my attention to drift before releasing its strange moisture. I started checking the floors obsessively, running my hands along the baseboards, feeling for dampness. My palms came away dry, yet an hour later, there it would be. Another small lake of that brackish water, always cold, always carrying that faint mineral stench. I called a plumber. He was a heavy-set man with kind eyes who spent 2 hours checking every pipe, every fitting, every conceivable source of water in the house. He found nothing. When I showed him where the puddles had appeared, he scratched his head and suggested I keep an eye on the humidity levels. He looked at me the way my wife used to look at me in those final months, with a mixture of concern and something uncomfortably close to pity. The bathroom became the epicenter of my unease. It was a small room, original to the house, with hexagonal floor tiles in faded white and a clawfoot tub that dominated the space. The mirror above the sink was old and slightly warped, creating subtle distortions in my reflection that I tried not to examine too closely. It was there that I first noticed the steam. I had just woken, stumbling into the bathroom with the grogginess of disrupted sleep, when I saw it, a fine mist clinging to the mirror's surface, droplets running in thin lines toward the sink. The shower was off. The hot water hadn't been touched since the previous evening. I pressed my hand to the glass and felt warmth, residual heat as if someone had just stepped out of a scalding bath. I stood there for a long moment, my reflection fractured through the condensation, watching the droplets trace their paths downward like tears. I wiped the mirror clean. I told myself it was nothing, but it kept happening. Every morning, sometimes in the middle of the night when I padded to the bathroom in darkness, the mirror would be fogged, the air thick with humidity that had no source. Once, I found a handprint in the steam, 5 fingers splayed wide, pressed against the glass from the inside. It was larger than my own hand. I know because I measured, holding my palm against the fading impression, watching my fingers fall short of those ghostly marks. I stopped sleeping well. The house seemed to breathe around me, settling into sounds that might have been wood contracting in the cool night air, or might have been footsteps in rooms I knew were empty. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant drip of water from somewhere I could never locate. In the morning, there would be wet footprints leading from the bathroom to my bedroom door, bare feet, larger than mine, stopping just at the threshold, as if whatever made them had stood there watching me sleep before retreating. I started keeping the bathroom door closed. I pushed a towel against the gap at the bottom, stuffed the keyhole with tissue. It didn't matter. The dampness found its way through, seeping under the door in thin rivulets that I would discover in the gray light of dawn, tracing patterns across the hallway floor that almost looked intentional, almost looked like words in a language I couldn't read. My colleague at work asked if I was feeling all right. I caught my reflection in the office window and saw someone I barely recognized. Hollow-eyed, skin pale and slightly damp with nervous sweat, hair uncombed. I told him I was fine. I told myself I was fine. But I had started avoiding mirrors entirely, unable to shake the feeling that my reflection moved a half-second too slow, that it blinked when I hadn't blinked, that it watched me with an expression I wasn't wearing. The neighbor came by once, an elderly woman who had lived on the street for decades. She brought cookies and asked how I was settling in. When I mentioned the water issues, her face changed. Something flickered behind her eyes, a recognition she quickly suppressed. She told me the house had been empty for 3 years before I moved in. She told me the family before me had left in the middle of the night, taking nothing, leaving furniture and photographs behind as if fleeing from something that couldn't be outrun. She didn't know what had happened to them. No one did. They simply vanished, she said, like water down a drain. After she left, I found a puddle on the front porch, directly where she had been standing. I began to research the house's history. The local library had archives, newspaper clippings, fragments of the past preserved in yellowing paper. I found references to the property dating back to its construction, mentions of owners who had come and gone with unusual frequency. But it was an article from 1987 that stopped my breath. A brief mention of a man who had lived alone in the house, who had complained to neighbors of water appearing from nowhere, of steam in empty rooms, of the feeling that he was sharing his home with something he couldn't see. The article didn't say what happened to him. It simply noted that the house had been sold at auction the following year, his belongings left unclaimed. That night, I dreamed of drowning. I was in the bathtub, my bathtub, the clawfoot one with the rust stains around the drain. But the water was black and cold and rising. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only watch as the water climbed past my chest, my neck, my chin. Just before it closed over my face, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tub, looking down at me with features I couldn't quite make out. It reached toward me with a hand that dripped darkness, and I woke gasping, tangled in sheets that were soaked through with sweat, or something that looked like sweat, but carried that same mineral smell, that same impossible cold. I turned on every light in the house. I sat in the living room until dawn, watching the shadows, listening to the drip, drip, drip that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When the sun finally rose, I went to the bathroom. The mirror was completely fogged, more heavily than ever before. Water pooled on the floor in a wide crescent, as if someone had stepped out of the tub and stood dripping before the sink. And there, in the steam on the mirror, words had been traced by an unseen finger. "You are never alone." I stared at those words until the heat faded and they disappeared, until the mirror was just a mirror again, and I was just a man standing in a bathroom that smelled of deep water and old drains. I reached out and touched the glass. It was warm. It was always warm now, even when the rest of the house was cold. I should leave. I know I should leave. Every rational part of my mind screams at me to pack a bag and walk out the door and never look back. But there's another part of me, a part that has grown louder in recent days, that wonders if leaving would make any difference. The water found me here. What's to say it won't find me anywhere? Last night I woke to the sound of the bathtub filling. I lay perfectly still, listening to the rush of water, the pipes groaning in the walls, the slow gurgle of liquid finding its level. I didn't get up to check. I didn't want to see what might be waiting in that water, what might be watching me with eyes adapted to darkness, with patience measured in decades. This morning the tub was empty, but the floor was wet, and there were footprints leading from the bathroom, through the hallway, into my bedroom. They stopped at the side of my bed. When I measured them against my own feet, they were larger. They were always larger. I am writing this in the kitchen, where the afternoon light is strongest, where I can almost convince myself that I am safe, that I am sane, that the puddle forming slowly in the corner of my vision is just condensation, just a quirk of old plumbing, just anything other than what I fear it might be. My hands are shaking. There is water under my fingernails that I don't remember touching. When I look in the window's reflection, I see myself, but also, just for a moment, a shape standing behind me, dripping, waiting. I don't know what wants me. I don't know if anything wants me at all. or if this is simply what happens when a mind stretched too thin begins to tear. My wife was right. I was becoming someone else. Maybe I've been becoming someone else for a long time, changing so slowly that I didn't notice until I was already gone. The landlord's handshake was damp. I understand now that he was trying to warn me, in his way. Some houses hold on to things, some houses remember, and some houses have been waiting so long for someone to fill their empty rooms that they will never, ever let go. There is water on the floor again. It is spreading toward my feet. It is cold, so cold, and I am no longer certain that I am the one writing these words, or if I am simply the hand that something else is using to speak. The mirror in the hallway is fogging over. I can hear the bathtub filling. I should go check. I should go see what's waiting for me in that dark water, what has been waiting all along in this house that breathes and drips and remembers. But I already know. I think I've always known. The water was here first. The water will be here last. And I am learning, slowly, what it means to drown on dry land. Story 7. The mailbox was overflowing when I arrived with the last of my boxes. Not with junk mail or advertisements, but with letters. Dozens of them, yellowed and swollen from humidity, crammed so tightly into the narrow metal slot that the lid had bent upward like a broken jaw. Strange, I thought, that neither I nor my wife had noticed them during the 3 visits we'd made before closing. Stranger still that the real estate agent hadn't bothered to clear them out. But I was tired. The August heat pressed down on my shoulders like wet wool, and the cicadas screamed their endless static from the oak trees lining the driveway. I grabbed the bundle of envelopes without looking at them and carried everything inside, dumping the mail on the kitchen counter along with takeout menus and a broken lamp I kept meaning to fix. The house was a Victorian, 3 stories of dark wood and tall windows that watched the street like half-lidded eyes. We'd gotten it for nearly 40% below market value, a number so absurd that my wife had spent 2 weeks convinced there was mold in the walls or bodies buried in the basement. But every inspection came back clean. The real estate agent, a thin man with fingers that never stopped moving, explained it simply. His uncle had left him the property, and he wanted nothing to do with it. Family complications, he said. Bad memories. He'd smiled when he said it, but his eyes had kept drifting toward the second-floor windows as if expecting to see someone looking down at us. I should have paid more attention to that smile. The first week passed in the blur of unpacking and furniture arrangement that accompanies any move. My wife took the guest bedroom as her home office, filling it with architectural drawings and the sharp smell of her drafting pencils. I claimed the basement for my workshop, though I found myself reluctant to spend time there alone. The ceiling was too low, and the single bulb cast shadows that seemed to lean toward me when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was on the 8th night that I finally remembered the letters. I was alone. My wife had left that morning for a conference in another city, leaving me with 3 days of empty rooms and settling noises. The house felt different without her. Larger, the hallways stretched longer than I remembered, and the stairs creaked in places they hadn't creaked before. I poured myself a drink and noticed the stack of mail still sitting on the counter where I'd abandoned it. The envelopes were all the same, plain white, standard size, with no return addresses. Each one bore the name of the real estate agent, written in handwriting that varied from letter to letter, some cramped and hurried, others loose and trembling. I counted 37 in total, spanning postmarks from the last 18 months. None had been opened. I opened the first one. The paper inside was thin, almost translucent, covered in handwriting so pressed into the page that I could feel the grooves with my fingertips. The writer identified himself only as a former tenant. He begged to be released from the contract. He described sleepless nights, a constant feeling of being observed from corners that should have been empty. He mentioned sounds in the walls, not the scurrying of rodents or the settling of old wood, but something that moved with deliberate purpose, something that paused when he paused, something that breathed. I told myself it was the rambling of a disturbed mind. People break down, invent horrors to explain ordinary unhappiness. I opened the second letter. A different hand, A different voice, but the same desperate plea. This tenant wrote of doors that wouldn't stay closed, of waking to find furniture rearranged in configurations that seemed almost meaningful, almost like messages in a language she couldn't read. She mentioned the basement specifically, how she'd gone down once to check the water heater and felt certain, absolutely certain, that something had been standing just behind her the entire time. She'd moved out after 6 weeks, forfeiting her deposit, and still the real estate agent wouldn't acknowledge her letters. The third letter was worse. The fourth was worse than that. By the time I'd read the 15th, my drink sat untouched and warm, and every shadow in the kitchen seemed to press closer. The accounts varied in detail but shared the same essential architecture of dread. The watching, the sounds, the basement, and always, always, the sense that the house was not empty, that it contained something patient and attentive, something that learned the rhythms of its occupants the way a predator learns the habits of prey. I put the letters down. The kitchen was silent except for the refrigerator's hum, but beneath that mechanical drone, I became aware of something else, a texture in the quiet, a thickness, as if the air itself were holding its breath. I walked through the house that night with every light blazing, checking windows, testing locks. Everything was as it should be. The doors were closed, the rooms were empty, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Not from outside, but from within the walls themselves, from the spaces behind the plaster and between the floorboards. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle around me. The creaks and groans were ordinary enough, the vocabulary of any old structure adjusting to temperature changes. But sometimes, in the gaps between those familiar sounds, I thought I heard something else, a soft displacement of air, a weight shifting, the almost inaudible whisper of fabric against wood. I didn't sleep. The following days developed a strange quality, as if time had become syrup-thick and reluctant to pass. I tried to work from my home office, but my concentration dissolved the moment I sat down. My eyes kept drifting to the window, to the hallway, to the basement door that I could see from my desk, a door I had begun to suspect was never quite in the same position twice. Sometimes it stood flush with the frame. Other times, there was a gap of an inch or two, a sliver of darkness that seemed to watch me with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. I started documenting things, photographs of the door at different times of day, measurements of furniture positions, notes on which lights I'd left on and which I'd found off. I told myself I was being scientific, methodical. I was not losing my mind. I was gathering evidence. The evidence was inconclusive. The door was always closed in my photographs. The furniture hadn't moved, or if it had, the differences were too subtle to measure. The lights functioned normally, but the feeling persisted, that sense of presence, that weight of attention pressing against the back of my neck like a held breath. On the second night alone, I woke at 3 a.m. to absolute silence. The refrigerator had stopped humming. The air conditioning had cut out. Even the usual chorus of insects had fallen quiet, as if the entire world had been muted by a hand pressed over its mouth. I lay rigid beneath the sheets, staring at the ceiling, and that was when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor directly above my bedroom. The third floor, the attic, a space I had checked during the move-in and found empty except for dust and old newspapers. A space with no entrance except a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway, a ladder I had pushed back up and latched securely. The footsteps crossed the attic in a straight line, paused above my bed, and stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The darkness pressed against my open eyes like a physical weight. After what felt like hours, the refrigerator hummed back to life. The air conditioning resumed its whisper. Outside, a single cicada began its electric song, and the spell, if that's what it was, broke. I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen with every light on, rereading the letters, searching for details I might have missed. One tenant mentioned the attic specifically. She wrote that she'd found footprints in the dust up there, footprints that led from the ladder to the far wall and stopped. as if whoever made them had walked directly into the wood and vanished. She'd covered the ladder with plastic sheeting before she left, she wrote, just to see. When she checked it the next morning, the plastic was undisturbed. But there were fresh footprints in the attic anyway. I thought about going up to check. I thought about it for a long time, standing at the bottom of the stairs with my hand on the banister, staring up at the hallway where the ladder waited behind its latched door. I didn't go. When my wife called that evening, I almost told her everything. The words crowded against my teeth, desperate to escape. The letters, the footsteps, the growing certainty that we had made a terrible mistake. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I caught my reflection in the darkened window across the room. I was standing in the kitchen. My reflection was standing in the kitchen. But behind my reflection, in the space where the hallway should have been empty, there was a shape, tall, motionless, watching. I spun around. The hallway was empty. When I looked back at the window, my reflection stood alone. I told my wife I missed her. I told her the house was fine. I told her I was sleeping well. The lies came easily. They felt necessary, protective. Though whether I was protecting her or myself, I couldn't say. That night I took the letters and burned them in the fireplace. I watched the paper curl and blacken, watched the desperate words disappear into ash and smoke. I told myself this was closure. I told myself I was choosing not to believe, but as the last letter crumbled, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the back of one envelope, barely visible, someone had written a single line in pencil. "It learns your name if you stay long enough." I stared at those words until the fire consumed them. Then I went upstairs, pausing outside the attic door just long enough to confirm that the latch was still secure. It was. Of course it was. And yet, there was dust on the hallway floor. Fine, gray, undisturbed, except for a single line of footprints leading from the attic door to the top of the stairs. The footprints were bare. They were human, and they pointed toward the bedroom where I'd been sleeping. I followed them with my eyes, my heart hammering against my ribs. They led across the hallway. They descended 3 stairs. Then they stopped. Whoever, whatever, had made them had gotten that far and simply waited. Stood there on the 3rd step, looking down at the door beyond which I had lain sleeping, and waited. I don't know how long I stood there. The house was silent. The footprints didn't move. Nothing moved. Eventually, I backed down the stairs without turning around. I didn't take my eyes off that 3rd step until I reached the 1st floor. Then I walked to the kitchen, sat down at the counter, and waited for morning. The sun rose eventually. It always does. I made coffee. I took a shower. I went through the motions of an ordinary day in an ordinary house, and I almost managed to convince myself that the footprints had been a trick of the light, that the shape in the window had been a reflection of something outside, that the letters had been the work of troubled minds rather than reliable witnesses. Almost. But when I went back upstairs to get dressed, the footprints were gone. The hallway floor was clean, and the attic door, the door I had checked, the door that had been latched, stood open by exactly 1 inch. Through that inch I could see only darkness. I closed the door. I tested the latch. I went back downstairs and waited for my wife to come home. And when she arrived the next evening, full of stories about her conference and complaints about airport delays, I smiled and listened and said nothing about any of it. That was 3 weeks ago. I've stopped looking for the letters I burned. I've stopped checking the attic door. I've stopped taking photographs or measuring furniture or documenting anything at all. None of it matters. The house keeps its own records. Last night, my wife woke me at 2 a.m, shaking my shoulder, her voice tight with something I'd never heard from her before. She asked me who I'd been talking to. She said she'd heard voices from downstairs. My voice and someone else's. Someone whose words she couldn't quite make out. Someone who sounded like they were standing very close to me. I told her I'd been asleep. I told her it must have been a dream. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked past me, toward the corner of our bedroom where the shadows gathered thickest. She said she thought she'd seen something standing there when she first woke up. A shape, tall, motionless, watching. I told her there was nothing there. I almost believed it. But this morning, when I went to brush my teeth, I noticed something written on the bathroom mirror. The words had been traced in the condensation from my shower, letters already fading as the steam dispersed. My name, written over and over, filling the glass from edge to edge. And beneath it, in handwriting I didn't recognize, stay. I wiped the mirror clean. I didn't tell my wife. I'm not going to tell anyone. Because here's the thing I've realized. The truth I've been circling for weeks without quite being able to look at directly. The former tenants sent their letters to the wrong person. They begged the real estate agent to release them from their contracts, but he couldn't have helped them even if he'd wanted to. The contract that matters isn't with him, it's with the house, and I think I've already signed it. The only question left, the one that keeps me awake each night, listening to the sounds that move through the walls, watching the shadows that lean closer when I'm not looking, is whether my wife has signed it too, or whether there's still time to get her out before she does. Because I heard something in her voice last night, when she asked who I'd been talking to, when she described the shape in the corner. She didn't sound frightened. She sounded curious. And somewhere above us, in the attic I no longer check, I could hear footsteps beginning their slow, patient circuit across the floor. Story 8. The price was a joke. That's what I kept telling myself as I stood on the cracked sidewalk, staring up at the duplex for the first time. 2 stories of Victorian architecture, original hardwood floors, bay windows catching the October light like something out of a catalog. The real estate listing had been buried deep in the classifieds, almost hidden, as if someone didn't really want it found. Monthly rent lower than my previous studio apartment. In this market, in this city, it made no sense. The landlord was a thin man with papery skin and eyes that never quite settled on my face. He walked me through the place with the hurried efficiency of someone eager to leave. The living room smelled of lemon polish and something underneath, something older, like the trapped air of decades. I noticed how his footsteps quickened past the narrow hallway on the second floor, how his explanations grew clipped and sparse. That's when I saw the door. It sat at the end of the hallway, painted the same cream white as the walls, but somehow darker. The wood seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A brass doorknob, green with age, and above it, an old-fashioned keyhole, the kind meant for skeleton keys. I asked about the room. The landlord's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He explained that the back room wasn't part of the rental. Storage, he said. Old furniture. Nothing of interest. The door was locked, had been for years, and unfortunately the key had been misplaced long ago. His grandfather had lost it, or perhaps his father. The details shifted as he spoke, liquid and uncertain. The only condition of my lease, he emphasized, was that I leave that door alone. I should have walked away. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs I chose to ignore. The rent too low, the explanations too vague, the way the landlord's hands trembled slightly when he glanced toward that hallway. But I was desperate. My previous living situation had collapsed, my savings were hemorrhaging, and here was salvation wrapped in crown molding and original fixtures. I signed the lease that afternoon. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, learned the particular language of the old house, which stairs creaked, which windows stuck, how the radiators clanked and hissed like living things when the heat kicked on. The duplex was beautiful in its decay, full of character and shadow. I convinced myself I'd made the right choice. Then came the footsteps. It was 3 in the morning when I first heard them. I'd been drifting in that liminal space between sleep and waking, my mind loose and unguarded, when the sound pulled me to full consciousness. Soft, shuffling steps, short and deliberate, coming from directly above the hallway, from the locked room. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening. The steps moved from one end of the room to the other, slow, measured, like someone testing the floorboards, pressing their weight down carefully, methodically, learning which ones would hold and which would betray them. Then silence. Then the pattern repeated. Back and forth, back and forth. I told myself it was the house settling. Old buildings make sounds, I reasoned. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. Pipes knock. Rodents nest in walls. There were 100 rational explanations, and I clung to each one like a lifeline. But deep down, in some primal part of my brain that still remembered how to fear the dark, I knew those were footsteps. Human footsteps. And they were pacing. The sounds came every night after that, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always the same pattern. The slow, shuffling walk from one side of the room to the other, the pause, the return. Sometimes I thought I could hear the floor groaning under the weight. Sometimes in the moments of stillness between steps, I swore I could hear breathing, ragged, patient. I stopped sleeping through the night. Dark circles carved themselves beneath my eyes. My work suffered. Colleagues asked if I was feeling well. I must have looked like a man being slowly hollowed out. I told them I was fine. I was not fine. During the day, I would stand at the end of the hallway and stare at that door. The cream paint had begun to look yellowed to me, sickly, like old teeth. I noticed things I hadn't before, faint scratches around the keyhole, as if someone had tried to pick the lock. Slight discoloration at the bottom of the door, a darker stain that might have been water damage, or might have been something else entirely. The brass doorknob was always cold to the touch, even when the rest of the house was warm. I checked. I checked more often than I should have. I tried to research the property. The library archives were surprisingly sparse. A few old photographs of the street, a brief mention in a historical registry. The duplex had been in the landlord's family for 3 generations. No scandals, no tragedies on record. But records can be incomplete. Records can lie. The neighbors were no help. The elderly woman next door pursed her lips when I mentioned the address and changed the subject with aggressive cheerfulness. The man across the street simply shook his head and walked away. No one wanted to talk about the house. No one wanted to talk about the room. 3 weeks in, I started noticing the smell. It was faint at first, a sweetish, cloying odor that seemed to seep from beneath the locked door. It reminded me of overripe fruit left too long in a bowl, or flowers rotting in stagnant water. I scrubbed the hallway floor with bleach. I set out air fresheners, opened windows, ran fans. Nothing helped. The smell grew stronger, ebbing and flowing with no discernible pattern. Some mornings, the hallway was almost unbearable. Other days, there was nothing at all. I called the landlord. His number went straight to voicemail. I left messages, calm at first, then increasingly frantic. He never returned my calls. The footsteps grew louder. They no longer sounded like someone testing the floor. They sounded purposeful now, eager. Sometimes they would stop directly on the other side of the door, and I would feel, this is the part that's hardest to explain, I would feel something waiting, a presence, a pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The door would seem to bulge slightly, as if something on the other side was pressing against it, listening for me. I started sleeping on the couch downstairs. It was farther from the room, and the sounds were muffled by distance and walls. But even there, I could hear them. Even there, I knew they were continuing, back and forth, all through the dark hours of the night. The scratches appeared on a Thursday. I came home from work to find them. Thin, parallel lines scored into the outside of the locked door, running from the handle down to the floor. Fresh. The wood shavings were still scattered on the hallway carpet. Something had clawed at the door, something from inside. I stood there for a long time, my keys digging into my palm, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The logical part of my mind grasped for explanations. An animal, perhaps. A raccoon or a large rat that had somehow gotten trapped. But the scratches were too high, too evenly spaced. They looked almost like fingers had made them. long, slender fingers, dragging downward in desperation or anticipation. That night, the footsteps were different. They didn't pace anymore. They gathered, clustered near the door. I could hear them, multiple sets now, I was certain of it. Small, shuffling movements. Whispers that might have been voices or might have been the wind finding gaps in the old walls. And beneath it all, a sound I can only describe as scratching. Fingernails against wood, rhythmic, insistent. I should have left. I should have packed a bag and fled and never looked back. But something held me there. Curiosity or stubbornness, or something darker, something that wanted to know. I had started dreaming about the room. In my dreams, the door was open, and beyond it was only blackness, absolute and total, and something in that blackness was calling my name. I found the key on a Sunday morning. I wasn't looking for it. I was searching for a screwdriver in the kitchen junk drawer when my fingers closed around cold metal. It was old, tarnished almost black, with an ornate bow shaped like a serpent eating its own tail. I knew immediately what it was. I knew it the way you know things in nightmares, with a certainty that bypasses reason entirely. The landlord had said the key was lost. He had been emphatic about it, and yet here it was, in a drawer I had emptied and organized just weeks before. A drawer I had opened 100 times since moving in. It had not been there before. I was certain of it. I stood in the kitchen for what felt like hours, turning the key over in my hands, watching the light play across its corroded surface. My reflection stared back at me from the window, gaunt, unshaven, with eyes that had forgotten how to rest. I barely recognized myself. I should have thrown the key away. I should have driven to the river and hurled it into the water and watched it sink. Instead, I walked upstairs. My feet carried me without my permission, drawn by some force I couldn't name. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the door at the end pulsing with a gravity all its own. The smell was overpowering now, sweet and rotten and somehow alive. The scratches on the door had multiplied overnight. They covered the entire surface, a chaotic latticework of gouges and furrows. And the doorknob, the brass doorknob that had always been cold, was warm, almost hot, as if something on the other side was pressing against it, waiting for this exact moment. I raised the key. The footsteps stopped. For the first time in weeks, there was silence from beyond the door. Complete, absolute silence. The kind of silence that holds its breath. I could feel them. I don't know how else to say it. I could feel them gathered on the other side, pressed against the wood, watching me through the keyhole with eyes I couldn't see. The key slid into the lock as if it had been made for it, as if it had always belonged there. I felt the mechanism inside, ancient and heavy, ready to turn. One twist. That's all it would take. And then I heard it. A voice, soft, rasping, seeping through the crack beneath the door like fog through a window. It spoke my name, not the name my colleagues used, not the name on my lease. The name my mother had called me when I was small and afraid of the dark. A name I had never told anyone. I stumbled backward. The key remained in the lock, hanging there like an accusation. I fled down the stairs, out the front door, into the cold morning air. I sat on the porch steps, shaking, until the sun was high enough to feel warm on my face. When I finally went back inside, the key was gone. The lock was empty. The hallway smelled of nothing but dust and old wood. But the scratches remained. And that night, when the footsteps started again, they were louder than ever, more insistent, more eager. They're waiting, I know now. They've been waiting for years, perhaps decades, for someone foolish enough to stay, someone desperate enough to listen, someone who would eventually find the key or be given it. I've started packing. I tell myself I'll leave tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. But every night, I find myself standing at the end of the hallway, staring at that door. Every night, the voice comes, soft and patient, whispering my true name through the darkness. And every night, the urge to answer grows a little stronger. The footsteps have changed again. They don't pace anymore. They don't cluster by the door. Now they move through the entire upstairs, spreading outward, exploring. I hear them in rooms that should be empty. I hear them directly above my bed. I hear them on the stairs. Last night, I woke to the sound of breathing beside my ear. Slow, rattling, close enough to feel against my skin. When I turned on the light, there was nothing there. But the door at the end of the hallway stood open, just a crack, no more than an inch. Beyond it was only darkness, thick and hungry and patient. I closed it. I checked the lock. It was secure. This morning, I found the key on my pillow. I haven't slept in 3 days. I can't remember the last time I ate a full meal. When I look in the mirror, I see someone who is no longer entirely here. A man being slowly erased, one night at a time. Sometimes I wonder if I'm losing my mind. Sometimes I hope that I am. Because the alternative is that the room is real. That what waits inside is real. And that it has already chosen me. Tonight, the footsteps are silent. The smell is gone. The house feels empty in a way it hasn't since I arrived. Clean and quiet and perfectly still. But I can feel the door watching me. I can feel something behind it. Coiled and patient, radiating a warmth I can sense even from downstairs. Waiting. The key is in my pocket. I haven't decided what I'll do with it. I haven't decided if the choice is even mine anymore. The night is young. The stairs are creaking one by one in a slow ascending pattern, and something in the darkness is whispering my name. Story 9. The smell hit me first, damp wood and something older, something that had soaked into the walls over decades and refused to leave. I stood in the doorway of the cabin with my duffel bag hanging from one shoulder, watching dust motes drift through the single beam of afternoon light that managed to pierce the grimy window. The real estate listing had called it rustic charm. The reality was peeling wallpaper, a sagging porch, and the persistent feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. But mistakes were all I had left. The divorce papers were signed. The apartment was gone. My savings account showed a number so small it felt like a joke. When I found the listing, a cabin in the woods for a price that seemed almost criminal, I didn't ask questions. I should have asked questions. The landlord had been eager, almost too eager, to finalize the arrangement over the phone. His voice carried a nervous quality, words tumbling out faster than necessary. When I asked about the previous tenants, there was a pause, just a heartbeat too long, before he told me they had left in a hurry. Family emergency, he said. These things happen. I didn't press further. At that price, I wasn't in a position to be particular. I dropped my bag on the floor and surveyed what would be my home for the next 3 months. The main room served as everything: kitchen, living area, and dining space, all compressed into perhaps 400 square feet of creaking floorboards and questionable electrical outlets. A small bedroom waded through a narrow doorway, and beyond that, a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The furniture was sparse: a worn couch that smelled of mildew, a wooden table with 3 mismatched chairs, and in the bedroom, a metal frame bed that groaned when I sat on it to test the mattress. That's when I noticed the backpack. It was wedged beneath the bed frame, pushed so far back against the wall that I almost missed it. A small thing, faded purple with cartoon characters I didn't recognize printed on the fabric. I had to get down on my hands and knees to reach it, the floor cold against my palms, and when I finally dragged it out into the dim light of the bedroom, I felt a strange reluctance to open it. Inside, I found clothes. Small clothes, carefully folded with a precision that seemed wrong, too deliberate, too controlled. A pair of jeans, 2 t-shirts, a sweater with a small tear at the cuff, and at the very bottom, folded into a tight square, a piece of paper. The handwriting was cramped, the kind of writing that comes from working quickly, from fear. The ink had smudged in places, as if the paper had been handled by trembling fingers. If you found this, please leave before dark. I read the words 3 times. Then I laughed, a short, hollow sound that echoed in the empty room and came back to me sounding wrong, distorted somehow by the angles of the walls. It had to be a prank. Some previous tenant's idea of a joke, left behind to startle whoever came next. I crumpled the note and tossed it toward the small trash bin in the corner. It missed, landing on the floor where it slowly began to unfold itself, as if the paper had a memory of its former shape. I told myself it meant nothing. The first night was difficult in the way that first nights in unfamiliar places always are. The bed was too soft in some places and too hard in others. The walls seemed to breathe with the wind, expanding and contracting in ways that old structures do, but which my city-trained ears couldn't translate into anything but threat. Around 2 a.m, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. But when I finally gathered the courage to look through the window, there was nothing but moonlight and the dark shapes of trees standing sentinel at the edge of the clearing. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning brought gray light and a fog that clung to the ground like something living. I made coffee with water from the tap that tasted faintly of iron and stood on the porch, watching the mist move between the trees. The nearest neighbor, according to the landlord, was 3 miles down a dirt road that had nearly swallowed my car on the drive in. The nearest town was 12 miles beyond that. I had wanted isolation. I had wanted silence. Now, surrounded by both, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, the weight of being completely alone. The day passed in small tasks, unpacking, cleaning surfaces that seemed to grow dusty again the moment I turned away, trying to get a cell signal that flickered in and out like a dying heartbeat. By afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that everything was fine, that the note was nothing, that the footsteps were animals, that the persistent feeling of being watched was just the paranoia of a man whose life had recently collapsed around him. Then I found the marks. They were on the inside of the bedroom closet, hidden behind a row of empty hangers that I had pushed aside while looking for extra blankets. Lines scratched into the wood, dozens of them, grouped in sets of 5 like someone counting days. Some were faint, barely visible, while others were gouged so deep that splinters of wood curled away from their edges. At the bottom of the marks, someone had carved a single word: hiding. My first instinct was to leave, to pack my bag, get in my car, and drive until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory. But where would I go? I had no money for a hotel, no friends willing to take me in, not after everything. My ex-wife had made sure of that, turning our mutual connections against me with a skill I hadn't known she possessed. The cabin, with all its wrongness, was the only option I had left. That night, I pushed the dresser against the bedroom door. The scratching started around midnight. It came from inside the walls, a slow, rhythmic sound like fingernails dragging across wood. I lay in bed, every muscle rigid, listening as it moved from one side of the room to the other, back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes it would stop, and in those moments of silence, I could hear my own heartbeat so loudly that it seemed to fill the entire cabin. Then the scratching would resume, and I would squeeze my eyes shut and tell myself it was mice. It had to be mice. Old cabins had mice. That was normal. That was explicable. But mice didn't scratch in patterns. Mice didn't pause, as if listening, before continuing their work. Mice didn't make sounds that seemed to come from directly inside the wall beside my head, inches from where I lay frozen beneath thin sheets that offered no protection from whatever was making that noise. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the third day, I had started talking to myself. Just small things at first, narrating my actions as I made breakfast, commenting on the weather, reading aloud from the few books I had brought. The sound of my own voice seemed to push back against the silence, to fill the spaces where darker things wanted to settle. But even my voice sounded wrong in that cabin, absorbed by the walls in ways that made me feel like I was speaking into a void. The fog never lifted. It hung around the cabin like a membrane, obscuring the trees that I knew were there but could no longer see. Sometimes I would stand at the window and watch the whiteness move, and I could swear I saw shapes within it. Figures that were almost human but not quite, standing just at the edge of visibility before dissolving back into the mist. I found more notes. They were hidden throughout the cabin, tucked into places I hadn't thought to look. Behind the bathroom mirror, folded into the pages of a water-damaged Bible in the nightstand, wedged between the cushions of the couch. All in the same cramped handwriting, all carrying the same desperate tone. It watches from the corner. Don't look at it directly. If you hear your name, don't answer. I told myself I should throw them away. I told myself they were nothing but the ravings of someone who had spent too long in isolation, someone whose mind had cracked under the weight of silence and solitude. But instead, I found myself reading them over and over, memorizing their warnings, following their instructions without consciously deciding to do so. I stopped looking into corners. I kept my eyes forward, always forward, even when I felt the pressure of attention on the back of my neck. Even when I heard sounds that might have been my name, whispered from somewhere I couldn't identify. On the fourth night, I saw it. I had gotten up to use the bathroom, a necessary journey that had become an exercise in terror, requiring me to navigate the dark hallway with only the weak beam of my phone's flashlight. I was halfway there when the light flickered, dimmed, and in that moment of uncertain illumination, I saw something standing in the doorway of the main room. It was tall, too tall. Its proportions were wrong in ways that my mind refused to fully process, angles and shadows that didn't align with any human anatomy I knew. It stood perfectly still, and though I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any features in the darkness, I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking at me. I don't remember how long we stood there. Seconds, minutes, hours. Time had become meaningless, compressed into that single moment of frozen terror. Then my phone's light steadied, the beam strengthening, and the doorway was empty. I didn't go to the bathroom. I went back to my room, shoved the dresser more firmly against the door, and sat on the bed with my back against the wall until morning came. The problem with fear is that it's exhausting. The human body isn't designed to maintain a constant state of hypervigilance. By the fifth day, I had begun to doubt everything. My perceptions, my memories, my grip on reality itself. Had I really seen something in the doorway? Or had my sleep-deprived brain manufactured a monster from shadows and fear? The notes I had found, had they been there all along? Or had I written them myself in some fugue state I couldn't remember? I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. It would make sense, wouldn't it? The divorce had devastated me in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. The loss of everything I had built, the relationship, the home, the future I had imagined, had left me hollowed out, vulnerable. Maybe this was what happened when the foundation crumbled. Maybe the human psyche, pushed too far, simply began to fracture. But even as I considered this, I noticed things that couldn't be explained by madness alone. The items I left in one place would appear in another when I looked away. A coffee cup I set on the table would be on the counter when I turned around. The clothes from the backpack, which I had shoved into a corner and tried to forget, kept appearing in different locations, draped over a chair, folded on the bed, hung on the back of the bathroom door. I started marking their positions, taking photos with my phone, trying to prove to myself that I wasn't moving them. The photos showed what I knew to be true. The items moved on their own. Or maybe I was the one moving them. Maybe I was doing things in the gaps, in the moments when I blinked, when my attention wavered. Maybe the monster in the doorway was me, standing in places I didn't remember going, doing things I couldn't recall. The thought terrified me more than any supernatural explanation. On the sixth evening, I tried to leave. I packed my bag. I walked to my car. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. Nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to start. No clicking, no struggling, just absolute silence. I tried again and again, each failed attempt ratcheting my desperation higher. When I finally gave up and popped the hood, I found that the battery cables had been disconnected, cleanly, deliberately, as if someone or something didn't want me to go. I looked back at the cabin. The windows stared at me like eyes. In the dying light of sunset, the structure seemed to lean toward me, eager, hungry. I had maybe 30 minutes before full dark. I reconnected the cables with shaking hands. The engine started on the first try. I threw the car into reverse and backed down the rutted driveway so fast that branches scraped against the doors and stones ricocheted off the undercarriage. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to put distance between myself and that place. But the dirt road seemed to stretch longer than I remembered. The trees pressed closer. The fog, impossibly, began to thicken, rolling in from all directions until my headlights illuminated nothing but white. I drove for what felt like hours, certain that I should have reached the main road, certain that something was wrong. When the cabin emerged from the mist in front of me, the same cabin, the same porch, the same windows watching, I felt something inside me break. I pulled into the clearing and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow even my thoughts. I sat behind the wheel as the last light faded from the sky, as darkness gathered around me like a physical presence, as the cabin waited with terrible patience. I'm still sitting here now. The fog has pressed against the windshield so thickly that I can no longer see the cabin, though I know it's there. Occasionally, I hear sounds. Footsteps circling the car, tapping on the glass, something that might be breathing just outside my window. I haven't looked. I won't look. The notes warned me about looking, but I don't know anymore if the notes were real, or if I wrote them myself, or if any of this is happening at all. Maybe I'm still in my old apartment, curled up in a corner, my mind having finally snapped under the weight of everything I've lost. Maybe I never came to the cabin. Maybe none of this is real, or maybe it's all real, and something has been waiting for me here. Something patient, something that doesn't need me to believe in it to exist. The scratching has started again. It's coming from beneath the car now, slow and deliberate, working its way around the undercarriage. I can feel vibrations through the floor, through the seat, through my bones. In the morning, I'll try to leave again. I'll drive until I find civilization, until I find people, until I can prove to myself that there's still a world beyond this fog. But right now, in the darkness, with something circling ever closer, I'm not certain that morning will ever come. And somewhere, in the cabin I can no longer see, a purple backpack waits beneath a bed, holding clothes that will never be worn again, and a note that I should have heeded when I had the chance. If you found this, please leave before dark. It's too late now. The dark has found me instead. Story 10. The tape had been placed with intention. That was the first thing I noticed when I moved in. The careful, deliberate way it wrapped around the camera's lens, 3 full layers of black electrical tape, applied with the precision of someone who wanted to make absolutely certain nothing could see through. Not the hasty work of a previous tenant who simply wanted privacy, but something methodical, almost ritualistic. I should have asked about it. I should have asked about a lot of things. The building superintendent, a gaunt man with tobacco-stained fingers who never quite met my eyes, had shown me the loft on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The space was impressive for the price. Exposed brick walls still bearing the ghosts of industrial machinery, high ceilings crisscrossed with original iron beams, and tall windows that flooded the open floor plan with diffuse light. The warehouse had been a textile factory in the 1920s, he explained, converted into residential units after decades of abandonment. I was only the 3rd person to live in this particular unit. When I pointed at the camera in the corner, mounted where the ceiling met 2 walls, he simply shrugged. An old security system, he said, disconnected years ago, nothing to worry about. His explanation felt rehearsed, delivered too quickly, and he moved on to discuss the heating system before I could press further. I signed the lease that afternoon. The rent was nearly half what I'd been paying across the city, and I was desperate to escape my previous apartment, a cramped studio where the walls seemed to close in a little more each night. I needed space. I needed somewhere I could finally breathe. For the first 3 weeks, I almost forgot about the camera entirely. I arranged my furniture, hung photographs on the brick walls, established the rhythms of a new life. My bed occupied the far corner, positioned beneath one of the large windows where morning light would wake me gently. I fell asleep each night to the building's ambient soundtrack, the distant clang of pipes, the whisper of wind through gaps in the old window frames, the occasional creak of the iron beams expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Then came the night I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately place, a tearing, wet and slow, like adhesive being peeled from skin. I lay perfectly still, my heart suddenly loud in my ears, listening. The sound continued for perhaps 5 seconds, that distinctive, sticky separation of tape releasing its grip, then stopped. Silence rushed in to fill its absence, thick and complete. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings made strange noises. I'd simply incorporated some random creak into a half-remembered dream. But I didn't get up to check. Something kept me pinned to the mattress, a primitive instinct that whispered, "Don't move, don't look, pretend you're still asleep." I lay there for what felt like hours, breathing shallow and controlled, until exhaustion finally pulled me back under. The next morning, I saw it immediately. The camera's lens was exposed, a small black eye staring down at me from its corner perch. The tape, all 3 careful layers of it, had been removed completely. Not torn away in ragged strips, but peeled off cleanly, leaving no residue on the housing. And the camera itself had shifted. Where it had once pointed toward the center of the room, it now angled distinctly toward my bed, toward the exact spot where my pillow lay. I stood beneath it for a long time, looking up. The mounting bracket showed no signs of recent manipulation, no scratches in the dust that coated everything in this old building. But the angle was undeniable. If the camera were functional, it would capture a perfect view of anyone sleeping in my bed. I called the superintendent. His phone went to voicemail, and he didn't return my message. I called again that evening, and then twice more the following day. When I finally caught him in the building's lobby 4 days later, he seemed surprised by my questions. The camera. He didn't remember any camera. All the old security equipment had been removed during renovations. I must be mistaken, but I wasn't mistaken. I had photographs on my phone from the day I'd first viewed the apartment. The camera clearly visible in the corner, its lens wrapped in that meticulous shroud of black tape. When I tried to show him, he was already walking away, muttering something about checking on a water heater. I found the tape in my bathroom wastebasket 2 days later. 3 strips of black electrical tape, slightly curled, arranged neatly at the bottom of the bin. I hadn't put them there. I lived alone. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed watching the camera's lens catch fragments of streetlight, a dull gleam that seemed almost purposeful, almost alive. The rational part of my mind constructed explanations, sleepwalking perhaps, or some dissociative episode I couldn't remember. The building was old. Maybe vibrations had shifted the camera's position over time. Maybe the tape's adhesive had simply failed after years of exposure. But none of these explanations accounted for the way the camera seemed to track me now. I tested it, moving from one side of the bed to the other, and I could swear the angle adjusted, just slightly, just enough to keep me centered in its field of view. I told myself it was a trick of perception, the way a portrait's eyes seem to follow you across a room. I told myself I was being paranoid. I started sleeping in the living area, on the couch, as far from the camera as the open floor plan allowed. For a few nights, this helped. I convinced myself the worst was over, that my anxiety had simply gotten the better of me. But then I noticed the red light. It was faint. So faint I might have imagined it. A tiny pinprick glow that appeared in the camera's housing after midnight and vanished before dawn. I stayed awake one night to watch for it, fighting exhaustion, and at exactly 2:47 a.m., there it was. A steady red pulse, like a heartbeat, lasting for perhaps 30 seconds before going dark. The camera's recording indicator. The next morning, I climbed onto a chair and examined the device up close. There were no visible wires connecting it to anything. The housing was dusty, clearly untouched for years. When I pressed my ear against the wall behind it, I heard nothing. No hum of electronics, no indication of power. The camera should have been completely dead. I decided to remove it. I found a screwdriver and approached the mounting bracket, but as I reached up, a wave of vertigo hit me so suddenly that I nearly fell. The room seemed to tilt, the walls stretching and compressing in my peripheral vision, and for one disorienting moment, I could have sworn I heard breathing, not my own, but close, intimate, coming from directly behind me. I spun around. The room was empty. When I turned back to the camera, the dizziness had passed, but my hands were shaking too badly to continue. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of broken sleep and mounting dread. I began noticing other things, small wrongnesses that accumulated like sediment. The bathroom mirror, which had always hung perfectly level, now tilted slightly to the left. My photographs had shifted on their hooks. Portraits that once faced forward now angled toward the camera's corner. My keys appeared in places I hadn't left them. My shoes rearranged themselves by the door. I stopped inviting anyone over. When my sister called to check in, I told her everything was fine, that I loved the new place, that I'd never felt better. The lies came easily. I couldn't explain what was happening because I didn't understand it myself. And more than that, I was beginning to fear that voicing my concerns would make them real, would confirm that something was genuinely wrong, either with the apartment or with me. The superintendent stopped answering his door. When I finally cornered him in the stairwell, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and fear. He asked if I'd been sleeping well. He asked if I had a history of mental illness. He suggested very gently that I might want to speak with someone, a professional perhaps. Then he excused himself and hurried away, and I realized that he'd never once looked toward my floor of the building. His gaze had remained fixed on the stairs, as if he couldn't bear to acknowledge what existed above. I started keeping a journal, documenting every anomaly, every impossible detail. The entries grew longer and more frantic with each passing night. 3 pages about the sound I'd heard coming from inside the walls, a rhythmic scratching that seemed to follow a pattern, almost like Morse code. 2 pages about the shadows that gathered in the camera's corner at dusk, darker than they should have been, moving independently of any light source. A full 5 pages about the night I woke to find my bedroom window standing wide open, and my breath visible in the sudden cold, despite having locked the window before bed, and despite the building's heating system running at full capacity. Then came the photograph. I found it slipped under my door one morning. A black and white image, slightly overexposed, showing my bed from above. From the exact angle of the camera, in the photograph, I was sleeping. My face turned toward the lens, my expression peaceful, unaware. The timestamp printed in the corner showed a date from 3 weeks ago, the first night I'd slept in the apartment. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was a single sentence. "We've been waiting for someone like you." I packed a bag that night. I couldn't stay. I knew that now, knew it with a certainty that felt almost physical. But as I reached for my front door, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My reflection in the hallway mirror. It wasn't moving with me. It stood perfectly still while I stood perfectly still. But its eyes, my eyes, weren't looking where mine were looking. They were looking up, at the camera in the corner, and the reflection was smiling. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, watching myself watch something I couldn't see. Long enough for the streetlights outside to flicker and die, long enough for the building to grow quiet in that particular way it does in the deepest hours of the night. Long enough for the reflection smile to widen into something that no longer looked like any expression my face had ever made. When I finally moved, the reflection moved with me, perfectly synchronized, as if nothing had happened. The smile was gone. My face was my own again. I didn't leave that night. I couldn't explain why. The door was right there, unlocked, and my bag was packed. But something held me in place. The same paralysis I'd felt that first night, that whispered command to stay still, to stay quiet, to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. I'm still here. It's been 3 months now. The camera's red light pulses every night at 2:47 a.m., and I've stopped trying to remove it. I've stopped trying to explain it. My journal entries have become shorter, more resigned. Last week, I wrote only 4 words. It knows I'm watching. Sometimes late at night I catch myself smiling at nothing. I'll be standing at the window, or brushing my teeth, or simply lying in bed staring at the ceiling, and I'll feel my lips pull back over my teeth in that unfamiliar expression, the one from the reflection. It feels wrong. It feels like wearing someone else's face. But it also feels like practice. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a voice that sounds less and less like my own, I wonder what I'm practicing for. I wonder who I'm becoming. I wonder if the person who first covered that camera lens with such careful, deliberate layers of tape had wondered the same things. I wonder if they ever found out. Story 11. The house smelled wrong from the first moment I stepped inside. Not the mustiness of abandonment or the staleness of closed rooms. Something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like overripe fruit left to decay in summer heat. The realtor assured me it was just the garden, years of neglect breeding strange odors. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. The price was impossibly low, and I had learned not to question fortune when it finally found me. My wife refused to come see the property. She said she trusted my judgment, but I knew the truth. She couldn't bear to look at another disappointment, another house we couldn't afford, another reminder of how far we'd fallen since the layoff. So I signed the papers alone, standing in that cramped kitchen with its yellowed linoleum and windows that seemed to absorb light rather than let it in. The garden was worse than the photographs suggested. What had once been carefully tended beds now sprawled in chaotic tangles of brown stalks and withered vines. Dead roses clung to their trellises like desiccated hands reaching for something just out of grasp. The grass, if you could call it that, had grown wild and then died in patches, leaving the earth exposed in irregular wounds across the yard. Everything was dead, uniformly and absolutely, as if the soil itself had been poisoned. I moved in on a Thursday in late October. My wife would join me in 2 weeks, once I'd made the place livable. Those first nights alone in the house, I told myself the creaking was just old bones settling, that the shadows in the corners were simply the absence of adequate lighting. The bedroom faced the garden, and sometimes, in the blue hour before dawn, I would wake with the absolute certainty that something was standing among the dead plants, watching my window. I never saw anything when I looked, but the feeling persisted, thick and cold, like a hand pressed against the back of my neck. On my 3rd day, I met the neighbor. He was an older man, perhaps 70, with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work. He appeared at the fence line while I was surveying the disaster of the garden, trying to decide where to begin. He told me he'd lived next door for 40 years. He remembered when the garden was beautiful, the most beautiful in the neighborhood, actually. The previous family had been devoted to it, almost obsessively so. They spent hours out there every day, even in winter, even in rain. He said they talked to the plants like they were people, called them by names. His voice dropped when he said this, and he glanced at the dead earth as if expecting it to respond. I asked what happened to them. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. Then he just shrugged and said they were gone one morning. No moving trucks, no goodbyes, no forwarding address. Just gone. The garden started dying the same week. He wished me luck and went back inside. I noticed he didn't look at the garden again as he walked away. That night, I dreamed of roots. They moved beneath the earth like veins pulsing with dark blood, threading through the soil in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost like writing. I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, and spent the remaining hours until dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. I started clearing the garden the next morning, partly because it needed to be done and partly because I needed to do something with my hands, something to keep my mind from wandering to dark places. The dead plants came up easily, their roots shallow and brittle, crumbling to dust at my touch. I filled bag after bag with brown husks and withered stems, and slowly, the earth began to reveal itself. That's when I found the first plaque. It was small, no larger than my palm. Made of some dark metal I couldn't identify, it had been buried about 6 inches deep, nestled among the roots of a dead hydrangea. I almost missed it. My trowel struck something hard, and I assumed it was a rock. But when I brushed away the dirt, I saw letters etched into the surface. A name I didn't recognize. A date from 15 years ago. I sat back on my heels, turning the plaque over in my hands. The metal was warm, warmer than it should have been from the cold October ground. The name meant nothing to me, just a string of syllables, someone I'd never met and never would. But the date bothered me. It was precise, month, day, year. Not a birth date or a death date as far as I could tell. Just a date marking something I couldn't understand. I found 3 more that afternoon. Each was identical in size and material, each bearing a different name and date. The dates spanned decades, the oldest from 1987, the most recent from just 2 years ago. None of the names were familiar. I arranged them on the porch railing, studying them as the sun set, and the garden sank into shadow. 4 plaques, 4 names, 4 dates. And beneath each dead plant I cleared, I began to expect another. I didn't tell my wife about them when she called that evening. She asked how the garden was coming along, and I said, fine, just a lot of work. She said she was proud of me for taking this on. She said she couldn't wait to see it. I said I couldn't wait either, and the lie tasted like copper on my tongue. Over the following week, I found 17 more plaques. They were everywhere, under the rose bushes, beside the fence posts, clustered around the base of a dead apple tree in the corner of the yard. Each one unique, each one carefully placed, as if the positions mattered, as if the garden was a map of something I couldn't read. I stopped bringing them inside after the first few days. Instead, I left them where I found them, marking each spot with a small flag so I could remember. The garden began to look like a miniature cemetery, orange flags sprouting from the earth where flowers should have been. The smell grew stronger as I dug. That sweet, organic scent I'd noticed the first day intensified, rising from the soil itself, clinging to my clothes and hair even after I showered. My wife mentioned it when she called, asked if I was wearing a new cologne. I told her it was just the garden, just the smell of turned earth and dead plants. She laughed and said it sounded romantic. I didn't laugh back. I started sleeping poorly. The dreams of roots returned, more vivid now, more insistent. In them, I wandered through the garden at night, and the earth was soft beneath my feet, yielding like flesh. The dead plants whispered to me in voices I almost recognized, saying names I almost knew. I would wake with dirt under my fingernails, though I always scrubbed them clean before bed. I told myself I was scratching in my sleep, that it was nothing, that it meant nothing, but then I noticed the footprints. They appeared one morning in the soft earth near the apple tree, bare feet, human-sized, leading from the fence to the center of the garden, and then simply stopping. No return prints, no sign of disturbance beyond those perfect impressions. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, feeling the weight of something watching from just beyond the edge of my vision. I bought a security camera that afternoon, installed it myself, aimed at the garden, at the spot where the footprints had appeared. That night, I sat at my laptop, watching the feed, waiting for something I couldn't name. Nothing came, but in the morning, the footprints were back, in a different spot, leading to a different flag. The camera showed nothing, just darkness, then dawn, with no movement in between. I rewound it 3 times, 4 times, searching for the moment when the prints appeared. There was nothing to find. I found the 23rd plaque on a Wednesday, 12 days after I'd started clearing the garden. It was buried deeper than the others, nearly a foot down, wedged between 2 thick roots that seemed to grip it like fingers. I had to use both hands to pry it free, and when it finally came loose, I fell backward, clutching it to my chest. The name on it was my surname. Just the surname. No first name, no date. The space where the date should have been was blank, the metal smooth and waiting. I stared at it until my vision blurred, until the letters seemed to shift and writhe like living things. The metal was warm in my hands, too warm, almost hot. I called my wife that night, and when she asked how I was, I told her I was fine. I told her the garden was almost ready. I told her I loved her, and I would see her soon. And then I sat on the porch in the darkness, holding the plaque with my name, watching the garden shift and breathe in the wind. The footprints appeared every morning now. Sometimes they led to my porch. Sometimes they circled the house. Once, I found them on the inside of my bedroom window, pressed against the glass from within. Though I had not walked there, had not stood there, had no memory of doing so. The dirt under my fingernails grew harder to explain. I found soil in my bed, in my shoes, ground into the seams of clothes I didn't remember wearing. My wife arrives tomorrow. I've been trying to write this down, to make sense of it, to find the thread of logic that will explain everything away. But the garden keeps calling to me. Even now, sitting at the kitchen table, I can feel it through the walls. That sweet smell, that pulse of something alive beneath the dead surface. Those roots threading through the darkness towards something I can't see. I went outside tonight. I don't remember deciding to go. One moment I was at the table. The next I was standing in the garden, barefoot, the cold earth soft beneath my feet. The moon was full, washing everything in silver light, and I could see the flags marking where the plaques were buried. 23 of them. 23 names I don't know, and one name I do. I picked up my trowel. The metal was cold against my palm. I walked to an empty patch of earth near the fence, a place I hadn't cleared yet, a place where something waited just beneath the surface. I don't know how I knew it was waiting, but I did. I started to dig. The soil parted easily, almost eagerly, like it had been waiting for me. And as I dug, I found myself humming a tune I didn't recognize, calling out to the darkness in words I had never learned. The plaque with my surname sat on the grass beside me, its blank date space gleaming in the moonlight. I should stop. I should go inside, lock the door, wait for my wife, tell her everything, leave this place and never return. But the garden needs tending. It has been neglected for so long, and somewhere, in the darkness beneath the earth, I can almost hear my name. Not my surname, but my true name. The one I've forgotten. The one they've been whispering since before I was born. They are so patient, these things beneath the garden. They have waited so long. The space for the date is empty, but not for much longer. Story 12. The lease agreement was 4 pages long, but the landlord only cared about one clause. He tapped his yellowed fingernail against the paragraph 3 times, making sure I understood. The basement was off limits. I could use everything else in the house. The vintage cookware, the linens that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme, the heavy oak furniture that seemed rooted to the floorboards. But the basement and its contents were to remain untouched. When I asked why, he simply said that some things were better left where they belonged. At $600 a month for a 3-bedroom Victorian in a market where studios went for twice that, I wasn't about to argue. The first 2 weeks passed without incident. I settled into the rhythms of the old house, learning which stairs creaked and which windows stuck, memorizing the particular way afternoon light fell through the parlor's stained glass and painted the walls in bruised purples and sickly greens. The house had a smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but persistent. Old wood and something else beneath it. Something organic and patient, like soil after rain, or the inside of an antique trunk that hadn't been opened in decades. I told myself I liked it. I told myself the house had character. The basement door was at the end of the hallway on the ground floor, painted the same cream color as the walls, as if someone had tried to make it disappear. There was no lock, just an old brass knob that I never touched. Through the gap beneath the door, I could sometimes feel cold air rising, carrying that smell, stronger there, more concentrated. I learned to walk past quickly. It was on the 15th night that I first heard it. I'd been drifting at the edge of sleep, that liminal space where consciousness frays and the mind begins to wander into stranger territories, when a sound pulled me back. A low, grinding noise, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then stopped. I lay perfectly still, my heart suddenly loud in my ears, and listened. The house settled around me with its usual symphony of pops and groans. Nothing more. I convinced myself it was the pipes. Old houses have old plumbing, and old plumbing makes old sounds. I repeated this to myself until the words lost meaning, until they became a kind of prayer, and eventually I slept. But the sound came again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, it seemed to last a little longer. Each time I could have sworn I heard something more, not just the grinding of wood against stone, but a rhythm to it, a purposefulness that simple settling could never explain. It sounded like furniture being rearranged, like chairs being pulled back from tables, like someone, or something, preparing a space. I started sleeping with the light on, then with the television on, then barely sleeping at all. During the days, I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I worked from home, answered emails, attended video calls with my camera carefully angled away from the corners of rooms that had begun to feel somehow wrong. My colleagues commented that I looked tired. I blamed it on adjusting to the new place. I didn't mention the way I'd started checking doors I knew I'd already closed, or how I'd begun to notice that objects weren't quite where I remembered leaving them. A coffee cup shifted 2 inches to the left. A book turned spine out when I was certain I'd placed its spine in. Small things, insignificant things, except they weren't. 3 weeks after moving in, I stood in the hallway at 2 in the morning, staring at the basement door. The sounds had woken me again, louder this time, unmistakable. Not just dragging, but something else. A tapping, rhythmic, patient, like knuckles rapping against wood from the other side. Like something down there knew I was listening. The gap beneath the door seemed darker than it should have been, a stripe of absolute black that seemed to absorb the light from the hallway fixture rather than reflect it. And as I watched, as I stood there frozen, my bare feet numb against the cold hardwood, I could have sworn I saw something move in that darkness, a shadow passing, a presence shifting. I went back to bed. I didn't sleep. The next morning I called the landlord. The phone rang 11 times before he answered, and when he did, his voice had a quality I couldn't quite identify. Not unfriendly, but cautious, guarded. I told him about the sounds. I told him I was concerned there might be an animal down there, maybe a raccoon that had found its way in through a broken window. There was a long pause. When he finally spoke, he told me the basement had no windows. He told me the sounds were just the house, that old houses talked to their occupants in ways newer constructions never could. He told me to stop listening so hard. Then he asked me if I'd been down there. I said no, which was the truth. He said good. That was all. Good. And then he hung up. That conversation should have satisfied me. It didn't. If anything, it made everything worse because now I couldn't stop thinking about what was down there that required such secrecy. What kind of furniture demanded its own private darkness? I began to research the house. Public records revealed little. It had been built in 1887, had passed through a handful of owners, had sat empty for nearly a decade before the current landlord purchased it for a sum that seemed far too low. There were no news stories, no scandals, no tragedies that I could find. Just an old house with an old basement full of old furniture that absolutely positively could not be used. The more I learned nothing, the more I couldn't stop. It was during this period of obsessive research that I noticed the first change in myself. I'd been sitting at my desk, scrolling through archived property documents, when I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked gaunt, hollowed. My eyes had developed a quality that I can only describe as hunted. The eyes of someone who has begun to see patterns in chaos, who finds meaning in meaningless arrangements. I'd lost weight. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a full meal. Food had begun to taste like nothing, like ash and air, and my appetite had dwindled to almost nothing along with my sleep. I told myself it was stress. I told myself I was adapting. But late at night, lying awake and listening, I began to understand that I wasn't adapting at all. I was being adapted. The house was doing something to me, reshaping me in small increments. wearing me down like water against stone. And the basement was the source of it, the heart of whatever wrong thing lived in these walls. On the 32nd night, I finally looked. I don't know what made me do it. Some combination of exhaustion and desperation, and a terrible, aching need to know. The sounds had been going on for hours, not just dragging now, but creaking, settling, the unmistakable rhythm of movement. I got out of bed. I walked down the stairs. I stood before the basement door, and this time I didn't walk away. The knob was cold against my palm, ice cold, as if the brass itself had been refrigerated. I turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism click, and I pulled the door open just a crack. The smell hit me first, that same organic scent, but intensified 100-fold, thick and loamy and somehow alive. Then the cold, a wave of it rolling up the stairs like breath from an open grave. And then the darkness, deeper than any darkness had a right to be, a blackness so complete that it seemed to have weight, to have substance. I stood at the top of those stairs and looked down into that void, and I saw them. The furniture. There was no light, no source of illumination that I could identify, and yet I could see them somehow. Chairs and tables and dressers and cabinets, dozens of pieces arranged in the space below. They were positioned in a circle, facing inward, as if gathered for some kind of meeting or ritual. And they had not been like this before. I knew it with absolute certainty, the way you know your own name, the way you know the sound of your own heartbeat. They had moved, they had arranged themselves. As I watched, one of the chairs shifted. It was a small movement, just an inch or two, a slight adjustment of position. But there was no one touching it, no force acting upon it. It simply moved, the legs scraping against the concrete floor with a sound that I recognized instantly, the same sound that had been haunting my nights for weeks. I should have run. I should have fled the house entirely, driven away and never looked back. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away, because as the chair shifted, I noticed something else, something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There was an empty space in the circle, a gap, perfectly sized for one more piece. And the furniture was facing it, all of it, every piece angled toward that emptiness as if waiting, as if expecting. I slammed the door shut. I ran back to my room. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall and my eyes fixed on the hallway, and I stayed that way until dawn broke and the sounds finally stopped. In the morning light, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it, hallucinated it, that weeks of poor sleep and mounting anxiety had finally cracked something essential in my mind. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts or hauntings or furniture that moves of its own accord. There had to be a rational explanation, a draft I hadn't noticed, a slanted floor, some quirk of the house's ancient architecture. But when I walked past the basement door that morning, I noticed something that destroyed every rational explanation I could construct. There were scratches on the inside of the door, fresh ones, pale against the painted wood, arranged in parallel lines, like something had been clawing at it, like something had been trying to get out, or trying to get in. I've been in this house for 47 days now. I don't go near the basement anymore. I've pushed a heavy bookshelf against the door, though I know that it won't be enough. The sounds continue every night, louder now, more insistent, and I've begun to notice other things. The furniture upstairs has started to change too. Small movements at first. A chair angled slightly different than I left it. A side table 3 inches further from the wall. But lately, the changes have been more pronounced. This morning I woke to find every piece of furniture in my bedroom facing my bed, facing me, arranged in a semicircle, as if they'd gathered in the night to watch me sleep. I tell myself I moved them in my sleep. I tell myself I'm losing my mind, but I don't believe either of those things anymore. The landlord called yesterday. I don't know how he knew something was wrong. I hadn't contacted him again since that first conversation, but his voice was different, resigned, almost sad. He asked me if I'd looked. I said yes. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, he said that the previous tenant had looked too. He said that's why the house had sat empty for so long. He said some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. And then he asked me a question that I can't stop thinking about. A question that haunts me more than any sound in the night ever could. He asked me if I'd started to feel stiff in the mornings, if my joints had begun to ache, to creak, to feel somehow less flexible than they used to be. I hung up without answering. But I know. I think I've known for a while now, in some deep and wordless part of myself, that I've been trying desperately to ignore. The gap in the circle, the empty space waiting to be filled, the way the furniture in my bedroom gathers closer each night, as if welcoming me into their congregation. I should leave. I should pack my things and abandon this place and never look back. But every time I try to go, I find myself standing in the hallway instead, staring at that cream-colored door, listening to the sounds below, feeling the cold air rise up through the gap and wrap around my ankles like a greeting, like an invitation. Tonight the bookshelf has moved. I didn't touch it. I haven't touched it in days. But this morning, it was 6 inches away from the door, and this evening, it's nearly a foot. The gap is growing. The door is becoming visible again, and my fingers, when I flex them, make a sound I've never heard before. A dry, creaking sound. Like old wood. Like antique hinges. Like something that was never meant to move at all. Finally learning how. Story 13. The landlord's hands trembled when he passed me the keys. I noticed it then. The slight quiver, the way his fingers released the cold metal a fraction too quickly, as if the contact burned him. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile people wear at funerals. Tight, performative, desperate to be anywhere else. The contract sat between us on his cluttered desk, its single page almost laughably brief for a lease agreement. No fixed term, he'd said. Stay as long as you need. The rent he quoted was absurd, nearly a fifth of what I'd been paying for my cramped studio across town. I signed without reading the fine print. I was too eager, too relieved. I should have wondered why he looked so grateful when the ink dried. The building rises 7 stories into a sky perpetually threatening rain. Its facade is the color of old bone, stained with decades of exhaust and weather, the kind of grime that becomes part of the architecture itself. The windows are tall and narrow, their frames painted black, and from the street they look like empty eye sockets staring down at the neighborhood. Most buildings this old have been renovated, gutted, turned into something sleek and modern. Not this one. This one has been left to age in peace, and there's something almost defiant about its decay, as if it refuses to become anything other than what it has always been. My apartment is on the 5th floor, 5C according to the tarnished brass numbers on my door. The hallway leading to it stretches longer than it should, lined with identical doors in faded burgundy, each bearing its own oxidized letter. 5A, 5B, 5D, 5E. They're always closed. In the 3 weeks since I moved in, I've never seen a single one of them open. I've never heard footsteps in the corridor, never caught the muffled sound of a television or a conversation bleeding through the walls. The silence here isn't peaceful. It's thick, pressurized, the kind that fills your ears until you start hearing things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there. I'm no longer certain. It started small, the way these things always do. During my first week, I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I felt something shift in my peripheral vision. A shadow, I thought, passing behind the frosted glass of my front door. I went to check, opened the door to an empty hallway. The overhead lights buzzed with their weak fluorescent glow, illuminating nothing but dust motes suspended in stale air. I stood there for a long moment, listening, but the building offered only its characteristic silence. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The second time, I was brushing my teeth before bed. The bathroom mirror faces the open door, and beyond that, the narrow corridor leading to the bedroom. In the reflection, I saw movement. A shape, human-sized, passing through the darkened hall. I spun around, toothbrush still in hand, foam dripping down my chin. Nothing. just the familiar geometry of my rented space, shadows pooling in corners where the lamplight couldn't reach. I checked every room that night, opened every closet, looked under the bed like I hadn't done since childhood. The apartment was empty. Of course it was empty. I lived alone. But I began to feel, with increasing certainty, that I wasn't. The smell came next. It crept into my awareness gradually, so subtle at first that I dismissed it as the mustiness of an old building, the accumulated scent of decades pressed into plaster and wood. But it grew stronger, more specific. It was a human smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but intimate. The warm, private scent of someone else's skin, their hair, their breath. I would catch it in the strangest places, lingering in the kitchen when I came home from work, concentrated near the bedroom closet, strongest of all in the narrow space behind the couch, where no one could possibly fit, where no one had any reason to be. I started leaving windows open despite the cold. The smell always returned. I tried to meet my neighbors. It seemed like the reasonable thing to do, the normal thing. I knocked on 5B one evening, rehearsing a casual introduction in my head. No answer. I tried 5D. Silence. I worked my way down the hall, knuckles rapping against wood that felt strangely warm to the touch, and received nothing but the hollow echo of my own attempts at contact. Downstairs, the same. Every floor, every door, the same impenetrable quiet. The mailboxes in the lobby offered no clues. Most of the name slots were empty, the metal doors slightly rusted, their tiny keyholes dark with disuse. I asked the building superintendent about it when I finally caught him in the basement, a stooped figure in gray coveralls who seemed almost startled to see another person. He told me the other tenants kept to themselves, preferred it that way. He didn't quite meet my eyes when he said it, and when I pressed for more information, how many units were occupied, how long the others had lived here, he suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere and shuffled away into the maze of pipes and boilers, leaving me alone with the mechanical heartbeat of the building. The sounds began after my second week. At night, when the city outside grew quiet, I would lie in bed and listen to the building breathe. It started as something almost imperceptible, a rhythmic creaking, like weight shifting on old floorboards. It came from above, from below, from the walls themselves. I told myself it was the building settling, the natural sounds of ancient architecture adjusting to temperature changes. But the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. It was the cadence of footsteps, of pacing, of someone moving through spaces just beyond my walls. And sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, I could swear I heard breathing that wasn't my own. Slow, measured inhalations coming from somewhere inside the apartment. I bought a flashlight. I started checking the rooms multiple times each night. I developed the habit of scanning every corner when I entered, of listening at doors before opening them, of watching the shadows for movement. My sleep deteriorated. I would wake at 3, at 4 in the morning, heart pounding, certain that something had just retreated from my bedside. The sheets beside me would be cold, but somehow rumpled, as if someone had been lying there and left moments before consciousness found me. The reflections troubled me most. I began noticing them in the third week, subtle wrongnesses in the mirrors, in the black glass of the windows at night, in any surface that threw back my image. At first it was just a delay, a fraction of a second, where my reflection seemed to move slightly after I did. Then the discrepancies grew. I would raise my hand and catch in the corner of my eye my reflection lowering its arm. I would turn away from the bathroom mirror and glimpse, just for an instant, my double remaining still, watching me go. I removed the mirror from the bathroom wall. I covered the one in the bedroom with a sheet. I started avoiding the windows after dark, but I couldn't avoid the glass panel set into my front door. I must have passed it 100 times in those early weeks without really seeing it. Frosted glass, letting in the dim light from the hallway, revealing nothing but vague shapes. But now I noticed that sometimes, when I looked at it from inside my apartment, there was a shape that shouldn't be there. A silhouette, human-sized, standing motionless in the corridor just beyond the door. It was always gone when I checked. When I yanked the door open, pulse racing, ready to confront whoever was watching me. Just the empty hallway, just the buzzing lights, just the closed doors of my silent neighbors. But the feeling remained, growing stronger each day, the absolute certainty that I was being observed. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. The living room felt marginally safer, more exits, more light from the street below. I kept the television on for noise, though the programs felt distant, irrelevant, transmissions from a world that had nothing to do with the one I now inhabited. My phone became a lifeline. I called old friends, colleagues, anyone who would talk. I needed to hear other voices, to confirm that the outside world still existed, that I hadn't somehow drifted into a pocket of reality where only this building remained. The last person I called was the landlord. I demanded answers. I told him about the sounds, the shadows, the feeling of presence. I told him I hadn't seen a single other tenant in nearly a month. He was quiet for a long time, so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he asked very softly if I'd checked the closet in the back bedroom, the one with the lock on the outside. I hadn't noticed the lock before. How had I not noticed the lock before? It was old brass, the same vintage as everything else in the building, set into the wooden frame at chest height. The key was still in it, turned to the locked position. I don't remember walking toward it. I don't remember reaching for the key. But I remember the sound it made when I turned it. A grinding click that echoed through the empty apartment like something waking up. The closet was deeper than it should have been. The back wall receded into darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, and the air that drifted out was warm, thick with that familiar human scent I'd been trying to escape for weeks. On the floor, in the thin layer of dust, I saw footprints. Dozens of them, overlapping, tracking back and forth between the closet and the rest of the apartment. They were the size of my own feet. They led everywhere. To the kitchen, to the bathroom, to the space beside my bed where I'd felt that presence night after night. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my grip, trying to understand, trying to make sense of something that refused to conform to any logic I knew. Behind me, in the apartment I'd called home for nearly a month, I heard the soft click of a door closing. And then, from deep inside the closet, from somewhere in that impossible darkness, I heard something else. Breathing, slow and patient, waiting. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to abandon everything I owned and never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. My body had become a foreign thing, disconnected from my will. And all I could do was stand there as the breathing grew louder, closer, as the darkness in front of me began to shift and condense into something almost like a shape. And then the flashlight died. In the blackness that followed, I felt a hand, impossibly cold, impossibly familiar, settle gently on my shoulder. A voice whispered in my ear, speaking words I couldn't quite understand but recognized nonetheless. They were my own words, in my own voice, welcoming me home. I don't know how long I stood there. When I finally moved, the closet was just a closet again, shallow, ordinary, empty, except for some old coat hangers and dust. The lock was gone from the outside of the door. I searched for it, running my hands over the wood, but found only smooth, unbroken paint. The next morning, I tried to leave the building. The front door opened onto a street I didn't recognize, lined with buildings I'd never seen before, beneath a sky the wrong shade of gray. I stood on the threshold for a long time, watching strangers pass by who never quite looked at me, until finally I retreated back inside. The lobby smelled like home now. The stairs felt familiar beneath my feet. Back in my apartment, I found the contract I'd signed sitting on the kitchen counter. I didn't remember leaving it there. The paper looked older than before, yellowed at the edges, and when I examined the signature line, I saw not one signature but dozens, layered over each other in the same cramped handwriting, each one slightly different, each one unmistakably my name. Through the wall, from the apartment next door, 5B, the one that had never answered my knocks, I heard movement for the first time. The soft creak of footsteps, the sound of someone settling in. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster and listened to myself unpacking boxes. Story 14. The realtor's smile never wavered, not even when I asked about the basement for the third time. She simply tapped her pen against the contract and reminded me that the price reflected certain conditions, certain non-negotiable conditions. I signed anyway. My wife thought I was impulsive. Maybe she was right. But when you find a 3-story townhouse in a quiet neighborhood for less than half the market value, you learn to stop asking questions. That was 6 weeks ago. The house smells like old paper and something else I cannot identify. A sweetness beneath the dust, like rotting flowers or overripe fruit left too long in a forgotten bowl. My wife claims she doesn't notice it anymore. She says I'm being paranoid. She says a lot of things lately, her voice growing more distant with each passing day, as if the house itself is slowly pushing us apart, room by room, silence by silence. I first went to the basement door on our second night here. The stairwell leading down is narrow, the walls pressing close like the throat of some ancient creature. 17 steps. I counted them in the dark, my hand trailing along the cool, damp plaster until my fingers found the door at the bottom. Oak, I think, though it's hard to tell beneath the layers of paint. Black, thick, applied with the kind of desperation that suggests someone wanted to seal something away rather than simply decorate. The padlock is industrial grade, the shackle welded directly to the hasp in a crude, permanent embrace. No key could open it. No key was ever meant to. The smell of humidity down there is almost alive. It coats your skin, seeps into your clothes, follows you back up those 17 steps like a loyal, unwanted companion. I told myself I would respect the contract. I told myself curiosity was a weakness, that some doors exist precisely because they should never be opened. For 2 weeks, I believed my own lies. Then the knocking started. The first time, I was alone. My wife had gone to visit her sister for the weekend, and the house felt larger without her. Not empty exactly, but expanded, as if the rooms had been holding their breath and finally exhaled. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard it. 3 soft taps, muffled but distinct, rising from somewhere beneath my feet. I froze, water still running over my hands, soap bubbles sliding down my wrists. The sound came again, 3 more taps, patient, deliberate. I turned off the faucet and stood perfectly still, listening to the silence that followed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I took a step toward the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. Directly below me, exactly where my foot had landed. I stepped back. The knocking stopped. I stepped forward again, testing, and the response came immediately. 3 knocks, perfectly synchronized with my movement, as if something down there was tracking my position through the floorboards. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, telling myself it was the pipes, the foundation settling, some rational explanation that would seem obvious in the morning light. But morning came, and the explanation didn't, and when my wife returned, I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd heard. How do you explain that the house is listening, that something beneath us is paying attention? The days began to blur together after that. I started walking differently, lighter, more carefully, trying to minimize the sound of my footsteps. But it didn't matter. The knocking came anyway, sometimes in response to my movements, sometimes unprompted, rising through the floor at odd hours. 3 in the morning, twilight, the dead middle of the afternoon. Always 3 knocks, always patient, always waiting for something I couldn't understand. My wife noticed the change in me before I did. She asked why I flinched every time the refrigerator hummed. She asked why I'd stopped going upstairs after dark. She asked, her voice careful and measured, if maybe I should talk to someone, a professional, someone who could help with the stress of the move. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to take her hand and lead her down those 17 steps and make her press her ear against that black-painted door and listen. But something stopped me. A thought, creeping and unwelcome. What if she didn't hear it? What if the knocking only came for me? The neighbor to our left, an elderly man with watery eyes and hands that trembled when he spoke, stopped me one morning as I was checking the mail. He asked if I was settling in all right. I said yes, fine. Everything was fine. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward my house with something that looked almost like pity. He mentioned casually that the previous owner had lived there for 37 years before moving away quite suddenly. He mentioned that the owner before that had only lasted 18 months. He mentioned, his voice dropping to a whisper, that there had been complaints about noise, rhythmic sounds, like someone hammering or pounding, always coming from inside the house, always stopping whenever anyone came to investigate. I asked him what he thought it was. He just shook his head and shuffled back toward his door, muttering something about old houses having long memories. That night, I did something I'd promised myself I wouldn't do. I went down to the basement door with a flashlight and a stethoscope I'd ordered online. A ridiculous purchase. The kind of thing that makes you question your own sanity even as you're clicking the buy button. The stairs seemed longer than before, the darkness thicker, pressing against the beam of my flashlight like something physical, something resistant. When I reached the bottom, the smell hit me with renewed force. Damp earth, mildew, and that sweet undercurrent that I still couldn't name. I pressed the stethoscope against the door and listened. At first, nothing. Just the hollow sound of my own breathing, the distant hum of the house's electrical system, the subtle creaking of old wood. I closed my eyes and concentrated, filtering out the background noise, searching for something, anything, that would confirm I wasn't losing my mind. And then I heard it. Breathing. Slow, rhythmic, impossibly close, as if someone were standing just on the other side of the door, their mouth inches from the wood, exhaling in long, deliberate sighs. The sound was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, too measured, too controlled, like something that had learned to breathe by watching others do it, mimicking the motion without understanding the purpose. I stumbled backward, the stethoscope clattering to the floor. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own ragged gasps. Then, from behind the door, tap, tap, tap. I ran. I took those 17 steps 2 at a time, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls, and I didn't stop until I was in the kitchen with my back against the counter and my hands shaking so badly I couldn't pour myself a glass of water. My wife found me there an hour later, still standing in the same position, staring at the floor as if I could see through it. She asked what was wrong. I told her I'd had a nightmare, that I must have been sleepwalking. She accepted the lie with a worried frown and guided me to bed, her hand warm and steady against my back. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the house settle around me, waiting for the knocking to start again. It didn't. But I could feel something different in the air, an awareness, a presence, as if whatever lived beneath us knew I had come looking and was pleased by my attention. The following week, I began to notice things. Small things, easily dismissed, but accumulating like evidence in a case I didn't want to solve. The basement door, which I was certain I'd left closed, standing slightly ajar when I came downstairs in the morning. Scratches on the floor near the stairwell entrance, long, parallel grooves in the hardwood, as if something heavy had been dragged. A cold spot at the bottom of the stairs that persisted regardless of the season, a pocket of frigid air that made my breath visible even on the warmest days. And the sounds changed too. The knocking became more complex, developing patterns that almost seemed like communication. Short sequences, long pauses, responses that varied depending on what I was doing. When I cooked dinner, 3 knocks. When I turned on the television, 2 knocks followed by a long silence. When I spoke my wife's name aloud, testing, half hoping I was imagining everything, the response was immediate and violent. A barrage of rapid thuds that lasted nearly a minute, so loud the pictures on the wall trembled. My wife heard that one. She stood in the doorway, with her hand pressed to her chest, her face pale, and asked what was happening. I told her it was the pipes, the old plumbing acting up. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Not belief exactly, but a decision to believe, a choice to accept my explanation rather than confront the alternative. We stopped talking about it after that. We stopped talking about a lot of things. I've started measuring the distance between the basement door and the rest of the house. I've started timing the intervals between knocks. I've started keeping a journal, documenting every sound, every anomaly, every moment when reality seems to slip slightly off its axis. My handwriting has become erratic, the letters cramped and uneven, and sometimes I find pages I don't remember writing, fragments of sentences that don't make sense, drawings of doors and staircases and something that might be a face pressed against glass, watching. Last night, I woke to the sound of footsteps, not from below, from the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, deliberate steps, moving past my door with a patience that suggested they had all the time in the world. I lay frozen in the darkness, my eyes fixed on the thin strip of light beneath the door, waiting for the shadow to pass. But nothing blocked the light. The footsteps continued, past my room, down the hall, toward the stairwell that leads to the basement, and then stopped. I heard the basement door creak open. 17 steps, descending, and then, rising from below, a sound I had never heard before. Laughter. Soft, almost gentle. The kind of laugh you might share with an old friend after a long absence. Except my wife was lying beside me, her breathing slow and steady, her body warm against mine, and I had been in bed for hours. This morning I checked the basement door. It was closed, the padlock still welded shut, the black paint undisturbed. But there, on the floor in front of it, I found something that made my stomach turn. A single footprint, pressed into a thin layer of dust that had accumulated overnight. A bare footprint, too small to be mine, too large to be my wife's, pointing toward the stairs, pointing up. I've been sitting at the kitchen table for the past 3 hours, staring at the floor, trying to convince myself that there's an explanation, that I'm tired, that the stress of the move has finally caught up with me, that houses don't remember, don't listen, don't respond. But I can hear it now, even as I write this. A soft, rhythmic sound from beneath my feet. Not knocking this time, scratching. And somewhere, in the walls or the floor or the spaces between, something is breathing. Slow, patient, waiting. I don't know what lives in my basement. I don't know if it's real or if I've finally lost my grip on sanity. But I know this. The scratching is getting closer. It's been getting closer for days, moving upward through the house, rising through the foundations like something learning to climb. And last night, just before I fell asleep, I felt something I've never felt before. A cold hand pressing gently against the underside of my mattress, pushing up. Story 15. The realtor had called it rustic charm. I should have known then. I arrived at the cabin on a Thursday evening in late October, when the sun already hung low and orange behind the tree line, casting the kind of shadows that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. The drive from the city had taken nearly 4 hours, the last 40 minutes on an unpaved road that wound through pine forests so dense the GPS signal flickered and died twice. By the time I pulled into the gravel clearing, my neck ached and my eyes burned from staring at endless walls of dark green. The cabin itself looked exactly like the photographs, perhaps too exactly, as if it had been frozen in time, waiting. 2 stories of weathered cedar, a wraparound porch with a single rocking chair, windows that reflected the dying light like closed eyes. The rental company had left the key under a ceramic frog near the door, and when I picked it up, I noticed the frog's painted smile had worn away on one side, leaving it with an expression that seemed to shift between welcoming and warning depending on the angle. I told myself I was being ridiculous. 37 years old, a senior analyst at a consulting firm, and here I was assigning emotions to garden decorations. That was precisely why I'd come here, to escape the constant noise, the emails at midnight, the sense that my thoughts had become fragmented things that never quite completed themselves. 2 weeks alone in the forest. Silence, stillness, recovery. The interior smelled of cedar and something else, something faintly sweet and organic that I couldn't identify. The furniture was sparse but functional. A worn leather couch, A wooden table with 4 chairs. A kitchen with appliances that looked like they'd been installed sometime in the 1980s. Upstairs, a bedroom with a queen mattress and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub stained the color of weak tea. Everything was clean, everything was adequate, and yet I found myself walking through the rooms with my shoulders tensed, as if expecting something to be wrong. Nothing was wrong. I unpacked my single suitcase, arranged my laptop and books on the kitchen table, and made myself a simple dinner from the groceries I'd brought. By the time I finished eating, full darkness had settled over the forest, and I realized I had never experienced true darkness before. Not like this. In the city, there was always light bleeding in from somewhere, always a glow on the horizon. Here, when I turned off the kitchen lamp, the blackness that pressed against the windows was absolute, a physical thing that seemed to have weight and texture. I left a lamp on in the living room that night. I'm not ashamed to admit it. The first sound came on the second night. I had spent the day hiking one of the trails that branched off from the property, following a creek until it widened into a small pond ringed with cattails. The exercise had exhausted me in a pleasant way, and I'd fallen asleep easily, lulled by the white noise of wind through pine needles. I woke at 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone immediately, instinctively, as if the specific number might explain why my heart was suddenly pounding against my ribs. The cabin was silent. The wind had stopped. And then I heard it again, the sound that had woken me. Footsteps on the porch. Not the scurrying of an animal. Not the settling of old wood. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, with the distinct rhythm of heel-toe that only a human gait produces. They moved from left to right, across the front of the house, paused directly below my bedroom window, and then continued around the corner toward the back. I lay frozen, my phone clutched to my chest, the screen's glow the only light in the room. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. A lost hiker, a neighbor checking on the property, perhaps even a large animal that merely sounded like footsteps to my sleep-addled brain. But some deeper, older part of me, the part that had kept my ancestors alive in dark forests, much like this one, that part knew better. That part told me to stay very, very still. The footsteps circled the entire cabin. I tracked their progress through sound alone. The creak of boards on the back porch, the softer crunch of gravel along the side, then silence as they presumably crossed the grass, then the wooden steps again at the front. A complete circuit, and then another, and another. I don't know how long it lasted. An hour, perhaps. Perhaps longer. At some point, the rhythm changed. The footsteps grew lighter, faster, as if whoever was walking had begun to run, but silently, impossibly silent except for those deliberate steps that I could feel through the floorboards as much as hear. And then they stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin 3 times, looking for footprints in the soft earth, for any sign of disturbance. I found nothing. The ground was smooth, undisturbed, as if no one had walked there in weeks. Over the following days, I developed theories. The cabin's construction caused sounds to echo strangely. Some acoustical quirk amplified and distorted the normal noises of the forest. Deer, perhaps, or wild boar, animals common to this region, might move in patterns that mimicked human locomotion. I wrote these theories in the notebook I'd brought for journaling, and reading them in daylight, they seemed reasonable, even obvious. But each night, the sounds returned. Not always footsteps. Sometimes it was knocking. 3 sharp raps on the front door that came at unpredictable intervals, always when I was just beginning to drift off. I would rush downstairs, throw open the door, and find only the empty porch, the rocking chair swaying slightly as if recently vacated, though there was never any wind. Sometimes it was scratching at the walls, a dry, rhythmic sound like fingernails on wood, always moving, never staying in one place long enough for me to pinpoint its source. And once, on the 5th night, I heard breathing. It came from outside my bedroom window. Heavy, deliberate breaths that fogged the glass from the outside. Though the temperature wasn't cold enough for condensation, I watched, paralyzed as the fog spread and retreated, in a pattern that didn't match my own terrified breathing. And in the morning, when I examined the window, I found a handprint on the exterior glass. A perfect, clear handprint pressed flat against the pane, positioned exactly where someone would place their palm if they were leaning close to peer inside. The handprint was facing inward, as if it had been made from inside the house. I started finding other things wrong. Small things at first, objects that weren't where I'd left them. My coffee mug moved from the kitchen counter to the dining table. My hiking boots, which I always placed by the front door, appeared at the foot of my bed. The book I'd been reading opened to a different page than the one I'd marked. I told myself I was tired, that isolation and poor sleep were affecting my memory, that this was precisely the kind of minor cognitive slippage that the constant stress of my city life had been causing. But then the wrongness began to spread. I noticed it first with the trees. The pine forest surrounding the cabin had seemed uniform when I arrived, a dense wall of identical green. But by the 7th day, I began to see patterns in their arrangement. Or rather, I began to see that the patterns were changing. A particular cluster of 3 trees that had stood to the left of the hiking trail now appeared on the right. The pond I'd discovered on my 2nd day had moved, or perhaps it had always been closer to the cabin than I remembered, its still water now visible from my bedroom window when I was certain it hadn't been before. I went to the pond. I walked the same trail, counting my steps, noting landmarks. 342 steps from the cabin door to the water's edge. The next day I counted again. 208 steps. The day after that, the trail itself was gone, and the pond sat directly behind the cabin, close enough that I could see my own reflection in its surface from the back porch. My reflection. That was when I first began to truly doubt myself. I stood on the porch, looking down at the water, and my reflection looked back at me. Same face, same posture, same clothes. But the reflection was smiling. A wide, unnatural smile that stretched the corners of its mouth past where a human smile should go. I was not smiling. I touched my face to be sure. My lips were pressed together, my jaw tight with fear. But in the water, my double grinned up at me, and as I watched, it raised one hand in a slow wave. I didn't wave back. I should have left. I know that now, and I knew it then. But something kept me there. Stubbornness, perhaps, or disbelief, or some other force that I still cannot name. I told myself that leaving would be admitting defeat, surrendering to what could only be hallucinations brought on by stress and solitude. I told myself that I had paid for 2 weeks, and I would stay for 2 weeks. I told myself many things, and none of them were the truth. The truth was that I had begun to forget how to leave. Each morning I would plan my departure. I would pack my bag, load my car, and drive away. Simple, logical, possible. But each morning I would instead find myself walking deeper into the forest, following trails that appeared and disappeared according to no pattern I could discern, searching for something I couldn't name. And each evening, I would return to the cabin with no memory of how I'd spent the hours. My shoes caked with mud from places I didn't remember visiting. My hands scratched by branches I didn't remember pushing aside. On the 10th night, I found the photographs. They were in a drawer I had checked before. I was certain I had checked it before. A drawer in the dresser in the bedroom that had been empty when I arrived. Now it contained a stack of photographs, old Polaroids with that distinctive washed-out color of the 1970s. They showed the cabin from various angles in various seasons. They showed the forest, the pond, the trails, and they showed people. The people were the worst part, because I recognized them, not their faces. The images were too degraded, the features too blurred by time and poor exposure. But I recognized their clothes, their postures, the way they stood on the porch or sat in the rocking chair or knelt by the water's edge. I recognized them because they were wearing my clothes. They were standing in my poses. They were me, or versions of me, captured in photographs that were older than I was, in a place I had never been before this October. At the bottom of the stack, I found one last photograph. It showed the bedroom where I now stood, taken from approximately the angle of the doorway. The bed was made, the curtains were drawn, and sitting on the edge of the mattress, looking directly at the camera with an expression of absolute terror, was a man in my jacket, my jeans, my hiking boots. His hands were raised as if to ward something off. His mouth was open in what might have been a scream. Behind him, barely visible in the shadowy corner of the room, stood a figure. Tall, thin, smiling. I turned around slowly. My breath stopped in my chest. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The corner of the room was empty. Of course it was empty. The figure in the photograph was just a shadow, a trick of the light, a defect in the ancient film. But the photograph was warm in my hands. Warm, as if it had just been developed, as if it had just been taken. It is now the 12th night. I am writing this by lamplight in the kitchen, with my back against the wall so nothing can approach me from behind. Outside, the footsteps have started again. Faster now, more urgent, circling the cabin in a pattern that has grown so familiar, I can almost predict each creak and groan. The rocking chair on the porch is moving, though there is no wind, and from somewhere deep in the forest, I can hear a sound like singing, or weeping, or both. I have tried to call for help. My phone shows full signal but connects to nothing. I have tried to leave. My car will not start, and when I attempted to walk to the main road, the trail led me in a circle back to the cabin, no matter which direction I chose. I have searched every room for an explanation, a clue, a reason why any of this is happening, and I have found only more photographs, more images of men who look like me, who dress like me, who came to this cabin seeking peace and found something else entirely. I do not know if what I am experiencing is real. I do not know if the cabin is haunted, or if the forest is wrong, or if my own mind has finally fractured under pressures I refuse to acknowledge. I do not know if I will ever leave this place, or if I have already become another photograph in that drawer, another echo of a man who made a terrible mistake. But I know one thing. The lamp in the living room just went out, and in the darkness that follows, I can hear breathing, not from outside the window this time, but from inside the room, from directly behind me, from so close that I can feel the warmth of it on the back of my neck. I am not going to turn around. I am not going to turn around. I am not going to.